In the heart of a snowstorm, a man happened upon 7 silent figures lying by the roadside, as if someone once cared for them, then quietly walked away. One German shepherd lay at the edge, shielding the others with its body, eyes closed but still waiting for something. When the man knelt down and lifted the smallest, frailest one into his arms, he had no idea he was touching a memory long buried by a forgotten system. What had really happened beneath that heavy layer of snow? And why were these lives left there, waiting to be found? The snow kept falling, like threads of white silk stitching the sky shut, blurring the windshield of the truck as it struggled up the winding mountain road. The dashboard clock showed just past 7 a.m., yet everything outside felt like midnight. No engines, no tire tracks, only the wind, slamming against the metal frame in sharp bursts, keeping time for a cold and lonely symphony. Caleb Dunn tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the high beams as they wrestled their way through the thick curtain of snow. He wasn't headed anywhere specific that morning. The last delivery had been dropped off the night before, and by now he should have been back at his rented cabin down the hill, pouring an old whiskey and breathing out the weight of the day. But instead, he'd chosen to drive away from town, as if trying to escape something that had just stirred inside him. A low howl slipped through the cracked window, sending a chill down Caleb's spine. His hand, still steady from years of routine, quietly turned up the heat. Alone in a frozen forest, it's easy to feel small, and Caleb had known that feeling far too long. Ever since the fire, ever since the day he stopped being called a firefighter and started being called a survivor. The road ahead curved gently. Caleb eased off the gas. The headlights swept across the snowbank, untouched and deep. And then he saw them. 7 dark shapes, still and heavy like stones half buried in snow. Not a wrecked car, not stray deer. Dogs. 7 of them, frozen stiff, eyes closed, their bodies dusted in frost. A few spines shivered faintly beneath the white. There were no howls, no scratching. Just silence, as if these fragile lives were waiting for the end to arrive without a sound. Caleb hit the brakes. The truck skidded slightly before locking into place, tires trembling over a thin sheen of ice. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. The door flew open. The wind sliced through his jacket like a blade, but Caleb plunged into the snow, boots sinking nearly to the knee. They were there, 7 curled-up bodies huddled together, trembling. One, larger than the rest, its coat a dark storm gray, was sprawled along the outer edge, shielding the smallest pup nestled deep in the center. They looked like a nest that had been torn apart, battered by the cold, but still holding together, if only by instinct. Caleb dropped to his knees, brushing away layers of snow from each muzzle. One of them stirred, blinking open tired eyes, still faintly pleading. There was no fresh blood, but scars traced some of their bodies, half-healed wounds that whispered of a place where mercy did not exist. No collars, no tracks, nothing but wind and ice. They'd been abandoned, and they had waited here. Maybe all night. Caleb ran back to the truck, unlocking the rear cargo hold. Now empty. He pulled out an old fleece blanket, a couple of rescue mats, and made his way back. Snow pelted the back of his neck. The wind tugged at his collar, but he bent low, as gently as possible, lifting each dog in his arms. The smallest one, a pale tan pup barely larger than a sack of leaves, was so light it barely seemed real in his hands. By the time Caleb placed the last dog inside, his jacket was soaked, his hands numb and rigid from the cold. But something inside his chest burned warm, like an echo of a voice that had waited years to be heard. "Don't walk away again!" He slammed the cargo door shut, rushed back to the driver's seat, restarted the engine. In the rearview mirror, 7 forms huddled motionless, but their eyes, just barely, were open. no barking, no whines. But Caleb knew. They had heard something. The truck rolled back into the white. The wind no longer felt like knives. Caleb pulled out his phone, searching for the nearest animal clinic. Over 40 miles, not close. But he knew. Every minute mattered. The line between life and loss could shrink to seconds out here. He pressed the gas, hands gripping the wheel tighter than they had in years, not looking at the road ahead, but at the mirror behind him. At the 7 lives now clinging to the last sliver of hope fate had sent their way. A gust swept through, covering the path ahead in blinding white, but inside Caleb now, there was light. In the back of the truck, the cold still snuck in through cracks in the metal, but it wasn't biting anymore, partly thanks to the heating system finally groaning to life, partly because 7 warm bodies were pressed close together, sharing what little breath and warmth they had left. Caleb pulled off at a remote rest stop, just a bare patch of land shielded by a crooked line of pines swaying under the weight of wind. He stepped out, walked around to the back. The latch creaked open with the weariness of something that had seen too much. The dim interior light cast a faint glow over the backs of the dogs, where the melting snow clung in uneven patches. Caleb stepped up and knelt beside the lined rescue mats. None of them moved. Their eyes were open, not alert, not bright, but dull and tired, like lamps on the verge of burning out. He watched them quietly, one by one. The first, ash-gray with a torn ear and a deep groove around its neck as if it had once been bound too tightly, was clearly the largest. It lay at the outer edge, its body curled just slightly outward, as though it had chosen to shield the others. Caleb reached out, gently brushing the wet fur, and when his hand made contact with the icy skin underneath, the dog's eye flickered open. No growl, no bark, just a long, steady gaze, one that made Caleb realize that look held no more expectations of humans. Next to it was a jet-black dog, its back leg twisted unnaturally. It was breathing quickly, each breath trembling like a fragile thread caught between life and the thin veil beyond. Caleb pulled the blanket closer, then slipped off his coat and laid it carefully across its back. He continued. Each dog bore a different mark, one so thin that its ribs pushed against skin, another with dried blood on its shoulder, another with a milky blind eye. But they all had one thing in common. Once they had trusted, and that trust had been betrayed. Only one, the smallest, lay tucked tightly between the 2 largest bodies. Its creamy coat nearly disappeared into the rescue padding, ears folded down, eyes shut tight as if still dreaming. Caleb leaned closer, his chest caught. The breathing was barely there. He ran a finger along its spine, slowly, cautiously, afraid to cause harm. His hand was warm, but the tiny body beneath it was cold. And then, a soft whimper, barely audible, followed by the smallest twitch of movement, enough to tell Caleb it was still alive. He lifted the tiny dog into his arms. It was so light, so insubstantial, that even Caleb, who had once carried limp bodies out of burning houses, felt his hands tremble. This body. It felt less like flesh and bone, more like a message left behind by something long extinguished. Caleb placed the pup against his chest, tucking it inside his coat and cradling it against his lap. And in that moment, something stirred deep within him. Not a memory, not an image, just a sensation, achingly familiar, like the way his wife used to look at him when they walked into their first rescue shelter. Like the grip of a child he'd once pulled from a collapsed house, fingers clenched around his as if refusing to ever let go. Familiar enough to make his heart contract, not from pain, but from something warm flickering to life beneath the ash that had settled there for far too long. "They don't believe in this world anymore," Caleb whispered, still looking into those barely open brown eyes. "But maybe, if someone just stopped long enough—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The wind howled through the trees again, tossing sheets of snow into the air. But inside the truck, bathed in soft yellow light, 7 silent creatures, and the man who once thought he had nothing left to hold on to, were clinging together to something fragile, something that still didn't have a name. Caleb pulled the final blanket over the group. He tightened the coat around the smallest one, then leaned back gently against the truck wall. Outside, snow kept falling. But in his eyes now, it no longer stood for cold or loneliness. It looked like threads of healing, quietly draping over every old wound, gentle as a promise. The sky began to shift. The white glow dimmed to gray, heavy with thickening clouds, a silent warning that the storm would soon grow worse. The daylight did little to cut through the frost. It only made every detail stand out more sharply against the biting cold. Caleb sat behind the wheel again, his eyes fixed not on the road, but on the mirror, where 7 fragile bodies huddled close, still silent, but alive. The truck's heater pushed at full strength, but the air was still sharp, not just because of the temperature, but because Caleb knew he was racing time. The nearest vet clinic was over 40 miles away. Mountain roads, black ice, tight curves, headwinds, all working against him. But Caleb had already made up his mind. There would be no delays. He had lost his wife in a fire, not because of the flames, but because the rescue crew had arrived too late. That feeling, if only they had come sooner, had weighed on him for 3 years, and this morning he would not let history repeat itself, even if the lives now waiting on him didn't wear human faces. His hands gripped the wheel harder as the tires rolled over a slick patch. The rubber slid slightly, a sharp hiss of friction echoing beneath the frame. Caleb eased off the gas, muscles tense, every fiber of his arms pulled tight like overstrung wire. The wind slammed against the driver's side. Pine branches cracked, and snow dumped onto the windshield like a heavy shroud. But Caleb didn't slow. He wouldn't let himself. Then, suddenly, traction was lost. The rear tires spun out. The truck twisted sideways across the narrow slope. Everything tipped. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. But for Caleb, those 2 seconds stretched like an eternity. The sound of tires skidding sliced through the silence, sharp as ice. The front of the truck jerked sideways, grazing the edge of a snow-filled ditch. One wheel lifted off the ground, causing the rear cargo bed to lurch violently. Blankets crashed to the floor, and chaos erupted behind him. Howls, yelps, panic, 7 terrified voices rising in a storm of fear that filled the steel cabin. Caleb braced his entire body, yanking the steering wheel hard in the opposite direction and slamming his foot on the gas just as the front wheels caught traction again. The truck dragged itself sideways, scraping back toward the center of the road. It didn't flip. But cold sweat poured down the back of Caleb's neck, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He brought the vehicle to a stop. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from memory, crashing back like an axe to the chest. 3 years ago, in a burning apartment, Caleb had held his wife's hand with the same desperate grip he now had on the steering wheel. Only back then, it was her hand that let go first. He said nothing. Couldn't. His throat locked up. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the steering wheel, and for the first time in years, his tears fell. Not out of pain, not regret, but because this time he hadn't let go. After a few minutes, the howls behind him softened. One of the dogs even crept toward the partition between the cab and the cargo area, licking gently at the air vent, as if asking, "Are you still there?" Caleb let out a shaky, tear-wet laugh. He wiped his face with his sleeve, nodding slightly to no one but himself. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'm here." The truck rumbled back to life. This time Caleb wasn't just cautious, he was resolute. The road ahead still stretched long and treacherous, but now he understood. This wasn't just a rescue run. It was a journey back to life. Mile by mile, the truck crept forward, over thick ice, through groves of pine, along curves slick with danger. But not once did Caleb's eyes stray from the path. Behind him, the pale morning light began to slip through the window seams, catching on drooping ears, faint breaths, and a row of tired eyes, no longer entirely hopeless. Inside his chest, something had begun to stir. Small, fragile, but unmistakable. Hope. The front door of Redstone Veterinary Shelter swung open with a dry creak against the wind. Caleb pushed through with his shoulder, still cradling the smallest dog against his chest. The bitter air clawed at his back, but the warmth ahead pulled him forward, as if he had stepped across some invisible line between two worlds. Behind the counter stood Dr. Miranda Hale, a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair pinned back into a neat bun. She looked up and froze. A man, soaked through, his arms wrapped around a limp puppy. Behind him, 6 other pairs of eyes peeked from the truck's rear compartment, no longer wild, no longer loud, just waiting. No explanation was needed. Miranda called out into the clinic, "Charlie." "Gurney. 7 of them." Then she turned to Caleb, motioning towards the treatment room door. "Bring them straight through." He nodded, wordless. Caleb had carried victims out of wreckage, lifted charred bodies from collapsed staircases. But this was different. Every step he took with these dogs felt like walking a vow that hadn't been spoken yet. 7 unnamed lives lay on thick towels across 3 treatment rooms. Miranda and her 2 assistants moved swiftly, checking vitals, applying saline to their eyes, drawing blood. Caleb sat quietly in the corner, eyes never leaving the motion around him. One of them, the black-coated dog from the outer edge, had a fractured rear leg, likely from impact or blunt force. The second, the gray one with the torn ear, had partial hearing loss, unresponsive to sound, startled only by touch. And the smallest one, the one Caleb had mentally named Brisket, was in critical condition. Body temperature dangerously low, muscles drawn in like a frost-bitten leaf in the heart of winter. Miranda frowned as she worked. "They've been starving for days. Some have old scars. Most were probably chained up, then dumped." Caleb clenched his fists, not in rage, but because everything he feared from that first glance was now truth. And that sorrow, it wasn't pity, it was understanding. When the assistant stepped out, Caleb approached Brisket's bed. The tiny pup lay wrapped in cloth, tucked beside a heat pad. Its eyes were closed, body twitching faintly in sleep. Caleb sat down beside it, letting his fingers rest gently on the damp fur. "You did good, little one," he whispered. "To still be here, that's its own kind of miracle." Miranda handed him a mug of hot tea. "Let them rest. They'll probably sleep for hours. Their bodies need time to recover." Caleb nodded his thanks, but didn't move. She watched him for a moment, then smiled softly. "You don't have to stay the whole night." Caleb answered without looking away. "I know, but I want to." Night fell quickly. Snow still danced beyond the windows, but it no longer raged. Caleb sat near the door, watching each dog sleep beneath warm blankets. Their breathing, soft and steady, became a quiet soundtrack to a new chapter beginning. He dozed off for a while. In a brief dream, he sat in the center of a fire. But instead of burning, the flames melted into light. And in that light, 7 pairs of eyes looked back at him, not asking why, not needing answers, just trusting. He woke near 2 a.m. Brisket had curled closer to the heat pad, breathing rhythmically. The black dog with the broken leg snored gently near the wall. Another one stirred and let out a sigh, soft as relief. Caleb smiled. Not everything was better. But undeniably, life was returning, little by little, like sunlight beginning to rise behind layers of gray cloud. The first rays of dawn streamed through the frost-blurred window of the veterinary clinic, soft as silk draped gently across the scars of a long night. In the quiet room, the dogs were still asleep, scattered over thick blankets, their breathing steadier now, their bodies no longer curled up in defense. Even the air seemed to have lost some of its bitter edge, softened by the warmth within. Caleb stirred from a shallow, broken sleep. His neck ached from resting all night against the wooden chair, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. No ambulance sirens, no screaming like those firehouse nights from the past. Just the wind outside the window and the soft breaths of a pack that had teetered on the edge of death. Miranda stepped in, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Still breathing?" she said with a faint smile. "You've got the patience of a saint." Caleb took the coffee, nodding. "I've waited in fire before. At least this time it's not fire." He stood up, moving slowly around the room, his eyes pausing on each dog like a commander taking silent roll call after battle. Beneath the tangled fur, old scars revealed themselves, stories never told, etched into skin. One dog, the ash-gray one that had lain at the edge, lifted its head as Caleb approached. Its eyes were steady, calm, and carried something that felt like responsibility, like the eldest among them. Caleb knelt down and brushed its back gently. "You were the Shield last night," he murmured, "so I'll call you Shield." The dog didn't react, but its eyes never left his, an unspoken acknowledgement. He walked to the one with the broken leg, now resting with a temporary splint and deep in sleep. It hadn't whimpered once the night before, only endured the pain in silence. That kind of resilience reminded Caleb of the soldiers he'd once worked alongside. "Bruiser," he whispered, "tough as nails." The third, small, light brown, with sharp, darting eyes, shifted slightly when Caleb neared. It didn't bark, but sniffed rapidly, one ear perked, clearly scanning his mood. Or maybe the whole room. "Hello, Scout," Caleb smiled. "The lookout?" Another, pitch black with a small white spot on its forehead, remained curled tight in sleep. The posture, peaceful and composed, struck Caleb as familiar, like someone who chose silence, not from fear, but to protect others. "Silent," he said softly, "because silence isn't weakness." He kept going, naming each one. Not randomly, not for fun, but because deep down, he no longer saw them as just dogs. He was calling to their souls. Finally, there was Brisket, the smallest, still nestled under layers of blankets, breathing slow but eyes more open now. As Caleb leaned in, Brisket tried to nudge forward, its nose brushing faintly against his hand. A tiny movement, but one that said, "I see you. I trust you." Caleb smiled and gave a small nod. "You don't need a new name. Brisket fits just right." After a quick breakfast prepared by Miranda, Caleb helped recheck their vitals. While brushing through Shield's fur, his fingers caught something hard just beneath the skin, near the base of the neck. "There's something here." Miranda stepped over, pulled on gloves, and gently traced the spot with her thumb. "It's a chip," she said after a pause. "An identification chip, usually embedded in military or K-9 training programs." Caleb froze. He looked at Miranda, then at Shield. still lying calmly, eyes watching him with a gaze that suddenly felt startlingly human. "Can you read it?" "Not here. I'll have to borrow a scanner from the main animal hospital in town." Caleb nodded, but the thought was already churning inside him. Who were they? Where had they come from? Who had once owned these lives? And how could anyone leave them like that? He glanced back at the group, each in their own position, each carrying the imprint of a past, abandoned, trained, or worse, used. They weren't just strays, they couldn't be. Caleb left the clinic with a list of names he'd just handwritten, and a question that followed him all the way home. If one of them had once been a K9, what happened that led all 7 to be left behind in the snow? Late afternoon. The last golden rays of the day filtered sideways through the clinic's windows, painting soft smears of light across the cream-colored tiles. Caleb stood alone in the small washroom near the treatment wing, hands braced on the sink, eyes locked on the mirror fogged faintly with steam. The man looking back wasn't the one he used to know. Eyes sunken, stubble unshaved, skin weathered, a forehead creased with time that could no longer be erased. But what held his gaze wasn't the exhaustion. It was the look in his eyes. A look that was no longer empty. Caleb closed his eyes. In the quiet air, a memory slowly unfolded. Smoke, sirens, flashing red lights in the night, and through it all, Emily's face. The woman he once thought would walk beside him for the rest of his life. She had once said, in that voice soft as early autumn wind, "I'm not afraid to die, Caleb. I'm just afraid you'll stop caring about life after I'm gone." And he had done exactly that for 3 years. He moved away from the old town, left the fire department, took no more shifts, skipped every memorial, spoke to no one outside of those who had to speak to him for work. Caleb chose to live like a ghost on snow-covered roads, driving his truck across thousands of miles without ever truly going anywhere. Until that morning. 7 lives lay in the snow, silent, fragile, and no one but him, stopped. Caleb opened his eyes. The face in the mirror still looked back. But this time, it wasn't accusing. It wasn't cold. It looked more like someone who had just rediscovered something they thought was long lost. He splashed cold water onto his face, letting it wash away what grief had settled there, then stepped out of the room. The soft, golden light of the hallway guided each footstep as he made his way back to the room where the dogs were resting. Miranda was adjusting Bruiser's bandages and checking the oxygen line. Shield lay near the door, head resting over its front paws, eyes half open, still alert, still watching, like a sentinel that needed no orders. Brisket was asleep, her nose wetter than the day before, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Caleb sat down quietly and reached out to stroke Scout's back, the sharp-eyed dog who always sniffed everything first. He could feel the warmth under his palm. A living body. A fragile trust beginning to bloom. "Are you planning to send them to the holding shelter?" Miranda asked gently. Caleb didn't respond right away. The question didn't surprise him. It wasn't even difficult to answer. But he knew whatever came next would change everything. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, eyes never leaving the dogs. "They don't need a place to wait for someone to choose them. They need someone who stays." Miranda nodded, her expression softening. "Do you have space?" "There's an old shed behind my cabin. Not much to look at, but I can fix it up. It has a roof, has power, and it has me." The last sentence came slowly, but with the certainty of a vow. A simple promise exchanged between a man and a pack of animals who had never belonged anywhere. Until now. Caleb stood and pulled out his phone. He typed a quick message to the landowner just outside town, requesting to lease the extra storage space behind the property. Then he turned back to Miranda, his eyes clear, no longer uncertain. "Take your time with the treatment. I'll be back to bring them home when they're strong enough." Miranda smiled, her voice touched with emotion. "They chose right," she said. "Not everyone would have stopped on that snowy road. But you did. And that's where every story begins." Caleb leaned down, placing a gentle hand on each of them: Shield, Bruiser, Scout, Silent, Brisket, Echo, and Rook. Each name spoken like a call back to life. The eyes that were once glazed with exhaustion now began to hold something new, a shimmer of trust, fragile and rare. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He wasn't sure if he had enough money, enough time, or enough knowledge to care for 7 beings carrying both physical and emotional scars. But for the first time in a very long while, he wasn't choosing to stand outside of life anymore. 3 days later, the snow was still falling, but now it came gently, a soft drift like winter breathing quietly through the pine ridge behind the hill. In the pale light of afternoon, an old wooden shed emerged, a place that had once held nothing more than spare tools, now swept clean, the floors laid with dry pine, every corner wrapped in thick blankets. The shed wasn't large, but it had a roof. It had a new electric heater Caleb had bought. Power flowed in from a long cable stretched from the cabin. It smelled of old wood and fresh straw, and most of all, it held the quiet sincerity of someone who had chosen to stay. Caleb stood in the center of the room, taking in each small bed made from repurposed cushions laid side by side. Before each bed sat a metal bowl, and above them, wooden nameplates Caleb had carved himself: Shield, Bruiser, Scout, Silent, Echo, Rook, Brisket. Each name a soft calling, a gentle declaration that these dogs didn't belong in cages, but in someone's heart. Caleb's truck came to a slow stop outside the shed. 7 heads rose in the back, alert eyes, no longer panicked like that first morning. Miranda had come along with an assistant, ensuring no injuries were aggravated during the ride. She smiled as she saw the space. "Not bad at all, Dunn." One by one, Caleb lifted them down, Shield first, then Scout, and Brisket last, held close to his chest like something too fragile to let go. The dogs stepped in slowly, sniffing the new space, some cautious, some nosing the water bowls, some looking around as if trying to understand whether this place was truly theirs now. Caleb sat down in the middle of the room. He didn't speak. He simply waited. After a while, Bruiser limped over and laid down by his side. Brisket followed, resting her head gently on the edge of his coat. Scout stayed further back, but both ears were perked, tail wagging faintly. Shield didn't come forward, but didn't turn away either. And Rook, the black and brown one, stood in the corner, body taut, eyes locked on Caleb, as if pulled tight by a string that might never snap, but would never loosen either. Rook didn't growl, didn't bark, just stood there, neither retreating nor approaching, like a spirit still deciding whether or not to forgive. Caleb met the gaze, calm and open. His voice was low. "You don't owe me anything. Just live. That's enough." Rook didn't move. But Rook didn't leave. That first night, Caleb slept on a fold-up cot in the corner. The heater hummed, but the room still held its cold. Yet no one complained. No howling. Just breath, the soft scratch of claws, the quiet clink of water bowls, and every now and then, Bruiser's light snoring. In the middle of the night, Caleb stirred at a faint sound. He turned his head and found Shield sitting beside him, head tilted, as if checking that the strange man hadn't disappeared. Caleb smiled, said nothing. He just reached out, and Shield rested a paw on his hand, like a silent agreement between two sentinels. By morning, pale gold light trickled through the slats in the wall. The dogs began to leave their corners, one by one, exploring the small yard behind the shed. Caleb opened the door and leaned against the frame, watching them step cautiously onto packed snow. They breathed the air like it was the first time they'd ever known the scent of freedom. Scout found a stick and started to chew. Brisket managed a few awkward steps, then fell, but didn't cry. She looked up at Caleb, tongue out, almost grinning. He laughed and tossed her an old rubber ball. Bruiser didn't run, but shadowed Caleb with each move. Shield still kept to the door, standing as if still on duty. Only Rook stayed inside. The door was open. The others were playing. But Rook lay close to the wall, eyes deep and unreadable, perhaps not sad, perhaps just listening. Caleb didn't push. He placed a bowl of water by the corner, then backed away. He understood. Some wounds can't be soothed by warmth or food. They need time, and the quiet promise of presence with no demands. By dusk, the dogs had gathered around him, eyes half closed, tails sweeping softly like wordless lullabies. He looked at each one, lives that had once been frozen in the snow, now breathing, moving, seeking warmth in one another. Not all of them trusted yet, but all of them had chosen to stay. Morning at the shed began like any other. Quiet paw steps over wooden floors, the soft clink of metal bowls as Caleb filled each one with warm, softened food and clean water. Outside, it was still cold, but sunlight had returned. It filtered through the cracks, casting a gentle gold over the curled-up bodies, over the steady rise and fall of chests, like a silent melody of recovery. Scout was already circling the yard. Bruiser limped along in slow, steady steps. Shield kept his post by the door with quiet determination. And Brisket, the smallest one, remained curled in the corner, eyes wide and brown, watching them all from a distance. Caleb had noticed it from the very beginning. In the 3 nights they'd spent at the shed, Brisket had made no sound, only the softest breath. Even when Scout accidentally stepped on her during play, Brisket didn't cry out. It wasn't because she couldn't bark. Caleb was sure of that. It was because she had chosen silence. While the others followed Caleb out into the yard, Brisket stayed curled in her corner. Caleb didn't rush her. Instead, he laid down an extra layer of soft blanket near the window, letting the morning light filter in and warm the place where she lay. Then, quietly, he sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "You don't have to do anything," he whispered. "Just breathe." Brisket didn't turn her head, but Caleb could feel the faintest tremor under her fur. Still breathing, still alive, however fragile. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to that snowy night. The truck had jolted when Caleb slammed the brakes. Everything outside was a white blur, but he knew what he had seen. 7 motionless figures, half buried in snow. He couldn't recall how he'd made it out of the cab, only the feeling of each trembling back, each silent, pleading glance. Brisket had been the last one, the smallest, tucked the deepest. So light she felt like a dried leaf in his hands. When Caleb picked her up, he thought he was holding the last flicker of warmth she had left. Her legs dangled limp, her head dropped sideways. And then, a sound. Barely a breath. A faint whimper like the wind exhaling. He never forgot that moment. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't begging. It was a declaration. Weak, distant, but defiant. "I'm still here." And from that moment, he had called her Brisket, not just for the soft brown of her fur, but because in his heart, she was the last one standing, the one who hadn't given up, even when the world had nearly closed its doors. Returning to the present, Caleb opened his eyes. Brisket was still there, but her gaze was drawn toward the window, toward the yard where the others were rolling and pawing through the morning snow. Caleb rose, poured warm water into a bowl, and sliced a small piece of boiled meat into thin strips. Sitting back down, he extended his hand slowly, palm open. No words, no pressure. After a while, so slowly, Brisket lifted her head. Her nose touched the meat, inhaled gently, then gave it a small, uncertain lick. But she didn't retreat. Caleb smiled, not because she had eaten, but because she had chosen to reach toward him. He sat there with her 10 more minutes, no words. Not until Brisket, with trembling legs, rose on her own, took a few unsteady steps, then lowered herself again near the blanket. Only then did Caleb quietly stand and take out his phone to snap a photo. The first photo of Brisket, not posed, not proud, just a small, fragile dog with deep brown eyes and a thin body, but still alive, and inching her way out of the shadows. That evening, the dogs lay around Caleb as he read under the soft glow of an old oil lamp. Shield rested his head across Caleb's leg. Scout curled up behind Silent. Bruiser stretched out near the door, ears half lifted toward any distant sound. Rook still kept his distance, but no longer pressed tightly to the wall. And Brisket, for the first time, didn't lie alone. She nestled between Shield and Scout, ears folded, eyes heavy with sleep. No barking, no whimpering, just steady breathing. And to Caleb, that was already a kind of miracle. On Tuesday morning, the sky hung low and gray, thick like coarse wool draped over the forest canopy. Mist clung to the treetops, reluctant to lift. Caleb pulled on his old jacket, the collar lining worn thin, and got ready to leave. But this time, it wasn't to find something new. It was to uncover something long buried. Shield sat quietly in the back of the truck, eyes calm as always. But today, something in that gaze felt deeper, as if Shield, too, understood that this journey was about him. Caleb didn't leash him. He simply opened the tailgate and said, "Let's go." Shield stepped into the bed of the truck, light-footed like a soldier answering a call without needing to be told. Their destination was the Beckett County Military Veterinary Data Center, the only facility nearby equipped to read the high-level military microchips implanted in elite K9 units. The ride was silent. Cold wind lashed the windshield. Snow drifted sideways. But Caleb didn't feel the chill. He had already accepted these dogs as part of his new life. Yet ever since discovering the chip under Shield's skin, one question had refused to let go. Why would 7 highly trained, clearly valuable dogs be abandoned without a trace? At the center, the front desk clerk was indifferent at first, until Caleb mentioned the phrase, Level 3K9 microchip. The man's demeanor changed instantly. He led Caleb into a private room and placed a call to a senior military vet. 15 minutes later, Shield stood on the exam table, still unchained, still calm. But as the doctor moved the scanner toward his neck, Shield's muscles tightened, posture straightened, and he stood at attention. Caleb froze. "Training reflex," said the vet, Lieutenant Colonel Ridley. "That's the response of a dog formerly assigned to a special operations unit. We see it in elite, EOD, or high-priority search units only." The scanner beeped. A code flashed across the monitor. K9-SHLD-0218/ATF-X4/Special Action Tier/Homeland Security Training Division. Caleb's hand clenched. "Special Action Tier?" he asked. Ridley nodded, his voice dropping to a low register. "That's a tier reserved for K9s trained in extreme risk operations, counterterrorism, explosive detection in active conflict zones, or classified tactical missions. SHIELD, or K9 SHLD, was part of a unit trained out of Black Ridge Base." Blackridge? Caleb blinked. But that facility shut down 4 years ago. Ridley paused. His gaze shifted to Shield, now lying down, eyes closed but ears still alert. Then he spoke slowly. There are things trained so deeply, they never leave. But sometimes, the one who disappears is the handler. Caleb sat still, the silence folding in around him. Images of the pack filled his mind. Brisket, quiet but resilient. Bruiser, scarred and stoic. Scout, sharp-eyed like a scout should be. And Rook, who had never once barked, whose gaze held the silence of something broken. None of them were just pets. They had once had roles, missions, someone they were trained to follow. And then, suddenly, they were cut off from all of it. Is there any way to trace their original handlers? Caleb asked. Ridley shook his head. That tier doesn't store data in public logs, but there is one way. If you can scan chips from the others, we might be able to identify their batch code. Sometimes that code leads us to the origin of the entire group. Caleb nodded. He understood now. This story wasn't just about saving the dogs. On the way back, he didn't speak. But as the truck turned onto the dirt path leading to the shed, Shield rose and looked toward home. Without a word, the dog leapt from the back, pacing steadily to the door like a soldier returning from a mission brief. Caleb followed. Inside, every dog lifted its head. Brisket stirred. Scout ran up to sniff his coat, and Rook, true to himself, remained in the back, silent but watching. Caleb placed a hand on Shield's back and exhaled. We're starting to understand, aren't we? Shield didn't answer, of course, but the slight tilt of his head, the deep stillness of his eyes. Something was awakening. 3 days after the visit to the Military Veterinary Center, Caleb stood before a worn, windowless building deep in the Roseford industrial sector, an old administrative office that once coordinated Central Region K-9 deployments. There was no sign out front. Just dusted-over windows, a ripped doormat, and the groan of an ancient HVAC system echoing through empty halls. But according to Ridley, this was where legacy data on unit batches and chip origins had once been stored, including batches like Shield's. Caleb knocked on door number 14. It cracked open just enough to reveal a sunken face, hollow eyes, and thinning hair, like a man who'd been buried in silence too long. His name was Dennis Keller, former data officer for the now-defunct Blackridge Division. There's nothing to discuss, Dennis said, voice hoarse, clipped, as if reflexively accustomed to denial. I just need to see the batch file linked to SHLD-0218, Caleb replied calmly. No copies, no recordings, no exports. I just want to understand what happened. You shouldn't dig into that, Dennis said coldly. What's shut down was meant to stay buried. Caleb held his gaze. He wasn't the firefighter who stood at the edge anymore. He'd stepped in, and he wasn't stepping back. If you don't talk, I'll send this chip data and the conditions of all 7 dogs to every major newsroom in the state, along with photos of their state when I found them and questions about private training centers that were quietly investigated. Dennis's eyes darkened. A long silence filled the air like dust in an old room. Finally, he opened a drawer, pulled out a thin file with yellowed pages, and tossed it onto the desk. X4 Private/Redwind contract, 7 units, 2020. Caleb opened it, sparse, but enough to make his chest tighten. Batch name, Redwind Batch Delta Breed, German Shepherd, Selective Strain Training. Purpose, multi-purpose, protection, explosive detection, human tracking. Primary contractor, Redwind Tactical Training, a private outfit investigated in 2021 for animal abuse and unauthorized overtraining. Notes: After contract termination, funding withdrawn. Final locations of trained dogs unreported. Status: missing, 7 units unaccounted for. Caleb took a long breath. He could see each of their eyes in his mind. Those eyes he'd pulled from the snow. The scars, Shield's precise movements, Rook's cautious stillness, Brisket's silent ache. They had been created through a system that didn't care for life, only contracts, performance, and profit. He looked up. Do you know how they were left behind? Dennis shook his head. For the first time, his voice softened. All I saw was that Redwind Delta's data was pulled from the system within 48 hours of the investigation. No one took responsibility. No one answered. And those animals vanished, like they'd never existed. But they did, Caleb said, his voice catching. They lived. They're still here. Dennis didn't reply. He simply turned his face away, like someone who had long known the truth, but had learned how dangerous truth could be when it stripped too many masks away. Caleb stepped out of the office, a thin file clutched in his hand. The sky above held no snow, but the wind bit into his skin like a warning. This path ahead wouldn't be as simple as laying down straw or naming a dog. It would cut deeper. Back at the shed, Caleb opened the door. The dogs were resting quietly. Shield had his head draped over Bruiser's leg. Scout and Brisket shared a corner of the old cushion pile. Silent looked up as Caleb entered, then closed his eyes again, tail tapping faintly. Only Rook, just like always, stood near the window, eyes fixed on the tree line. But this time, when Caleb walked in, Rook turned to face him. No flinch, no retreat, just a steady gaze like waiting. Caleb stepped over and sat beside him. We know now, Rook, he said softly. We know who made you, and we know how they left you behind. Rook didn't move. But in those silent eyes, Caleb saw something achingly familiar. Silence not born of fear, but from having once trusted too deeply, too loyally, until betrayal became instinct. The road to Redwind Training Facility no longer existed on any map. Google only showed a fading gray trail that twisted through dense pine, then vanished at a flat patch of land. Caleb had to stop the truck 3 times to double-check his path, until he finally spotted a rusted sign half swallowed by tall grass, barely legible. Training Division, authorized entry only. What had once been a tactical K-9 training base was now nothing more than a decaying ghost, the hollowed-out shell of an unnamed nightmare. The front gate wasn't locked, just a loop of chain resting lazily over a rusted bar. Inside, buildings of cold brick and sagging steel roofs stood deathly still. The high-mounted floodlights hung broken, leaning toward the ground like the necks of the fallen. Caleb walked slowly. Each step felt like it pressed into a past someone had tried to bury for good. He found Building 3. According to the file, it had housed the primary Redwind Delta training unit. But now, part of the structure had been torn down. Faded paint peeled from the walls. Windows were boarded up with weather-warped planks. Behind the building, a short concrete wall emerged, almost completely hidden beneath ivy and weeds. Caleb pulled the vines aside, revealing a small metal door, unlatched, held shut only by a stone. He pushed gently. The door groaned open with a long screech that chilled his spine. Inside was a row of underground kennels. No natural light, no windows, only mold-streaked walls, the stench of dried waste, and the tang of rusted iron. Caleb descended the stairs, flashlight trembling in his hand. The first kennel was empty, though traces of old straw remained, not fresh but not ancient either. A dented aluminum bowl lay on its side beside a leather collar, cleanly cut. The second had claw marks on the wall. Deep, sharp, blood, long dried, streaked across cracked cement. A broken nail still clung to the edge. The third. Caleb couldn't move forward. He stood frozen. Etched into the concrete, by claw or some other hard object, was a crude line of numbers. 7, 6, 5, 3, 1. And beneath it, carved with frantic, shaking force, "Don't forget us." Caleb stepped back. His chest tightened like a vice. He couldn't tell if what he heard was wind through a vent, or the faint echo of breaths that once filled this space from creatures who had lived and trusted, and were abandoned without witness. He sat down, his back against the cold wall. The beam from his flashlight flickered. The light, like his resolve, was shaken but not broken. A memory surged forward, an old fire. Years ago, Caleb had pulled a little girl from a burning building, but he hadn't made it back in time to save her father, a fellow firefighter trapped in the lower floor. The girl lived. But Caleb had stopped living for himself after that day. You can't save everyone, they always say. But what haunts a person most isn't the ones they couldn't save. It's the times they didn't try one more time. He stood up abruptly, searching every inch of the space. In the corner near the last kennel, he spotted something. A small metal tag, round and weather-stained like a forgotten coin. He wiped it clean. RW-K9-X7-03. A code never mentioned in the file. An eighth dog, one of the 7, struck from the record, or the one that never made it out? Caleb slipped the tag into his pocket. As he climbed back up the stairs, he turned once more, looking at the row of silent cages, boxes that once held loyalty, pain, and erasure. Outside, he stopped the truck on the dirt road and looked back. The afternoon light was fading. Clouds broke slightly. A final shaft of sunlight touched the trees on the edge of the property, as if casting one last, quiet farewell over a place that had once been a hell. Caleb opened the door, pulled out his notebook, and wrote on a blank page. 7 survived. But I don't believe there were only 7. I can't erase numbers that someone else already tried to. And below it, a final line. We'll find RWX7-03, not out of curiosity, but because justice, no matter how late, still matters. Night fell quickly as winter deepened. Snow began to settle once again on the roof of the shed, quiet as memory, soft as grief, cold as truth. But inside, in that small space, something was beginning to change. Caleb lay on the fold-out bed, wrapped in a thin blanket. The oil lamp flickered softly beside him, casting a warm, golden hue across the wooden floor. The dogs were scattered quietly throughout the room. Shield by the door, Scout and Silent curled near the wood stove, and Brisket bundled up on the wool rug. But what caught Caleb most off guard, and took him several minutes to believe, was Rook. Rook, the most guarded, the most aloof of them all, was lying right at the foot of his bed. No sound. No warning. Caleb had simply stirred awake in the middle of the night, and there Rook was, head resting against the bed frame, eyes half-lidded like a soldier who had finally laid down his armor. Caleb didn't reach out. He simply lay still, eyes drifting to the misty skylight above, where the pale moonlight shimmered faintly behind clouds beginning to pull away. The dogs didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every silent step closer, every glance no longer shying away. These were the truest words, needing no translation. The next morning, snow had fallen like feathers. A soft, powdery white now blanketed the land behind the shed, gentle enough not to hurt, thick enough to record every paw print. Caleb opened the barn door, bundled in his thickest coat, carrying a few worn-out rubber balls and some smoothed wooden sticks. Then he turned, clapped his hands once. "Come on out," he called. Scout was the first to race through the door, tail wagging like fear had never lived in her bones. Brisket followed, hobbling slightly, but eyes lit up with eager spark. Shield strode out with firm steps, then Bruiser, silent. And finally, Rook emerged too. Not fast, but deliberate, voluntary. Caleb threw the first ball. Scout darted off like an arrow, Paws skimming the snow with a joyous rhythm. Bruiser grabbed a wooden stick, gave a playful growl, and shook it as if to declare, "I still got it." Brisket rolled in the snow, her mouth open in what could only be described as a smile. And Caleb, he laughed, really laughed, not a polite chuckle, not a hollow echo, but a full, unguarded laugh, erupting from a place deep in his chest that hadn't been touched in years. He ran, called, threw sticks, clapped his hands. The dogs chased after him, barked in delight, leapt up in bursts of joy. Snow flew like sparks in the winter air, catching the light and scattering it across a silver sky. In that moment, no one carried burdens. No one bore their past. There was only now. Only breath, and the sun gently climbing over the distant hills. When they finally collapsed into the snow, panting with wild eyes and warm tongues, Caleb sat on the wooden steps, wiping sweat from his brow, quietly watching each of them. Shield, alert but relaxed now. Scout, curious and swift but returning on command. Silent, no longer hiding in the corners. Brisket, still wordless but stepping farther than she ever had. And Rook, still silent, still solemn, but lying beside him now, uninvited but unafraid. Caleb said softly, "Trust. It's not something we're born knowing. But maybe, if a pack of abandoned dogs can learn to trust again, maybe we can too." The wind swept through the pine ridge behind him. A single dried needle drifted down, landing gently on the snow, like a whisper. Caleb took a deep breath. He knew there were still questions. About RWX 7-03, about Redwind, about others, maybe still waiting somewhere, still unheard. But today, right here, one truth stood clear. The dogs had begun to believe again. Later that afternoon, the last layer of snow began to melt. The air was crisp, clear after days of clouded skies. Sunlight shimmered through the beads of ice still clinging to the grass. Caleb was clearing the backyard when Brisket, as usual, wandered the yard, sniffing aimlessly. But something about her movements felt different. She sniffed slowly, deliberately. Each step forward carried her in a specific direction, not looping, not meandering. She stopped at the edge of the fence, turned, and looked at Caleb. He set his gloves down, walked over. Brisket touched her nose to his hand, then turned and walked away. Not aimless, leading. Caleb followed, heart thudding in a strange, quiet rhythm, some strange instinct scraping at the edge of his chest. Brisket led him past the overgrown lot behind the barn, down a narrow trail he hadn't noticed before. The dense pines began to open, and the sound of flowing water emerged. Soft at first, then clearer. The river. Brisket picked up speed, paws sinking into the muddy snow, ears standing high. By the time they reached the riverbank, Caleb knew something was wrong. The air carried the faint sting of iron. Brisket froze at a cluster of reeds by the water. Then, she howled. It was the first sound Caleb had ever heard from her. Not loud, not long, but deep, like it had been torn from some unreachable part of her memory. Caleb stepped forward. In the thicket of reeds lay the frozen body of a dog. Gray coat, a deep gash along the side, but what stopped Caleb cold was the torn leather collar, its insignia nearly erased. RW-K9. Brisket didn't bark. She stood beside the body, gently touched her nose to the dead dog's ear, then pulled back, like trying to wake someone who had been asleep for far too long. Caleb knelt down, brushing away the hardened snow from the body. On the front left leg, a mark once tied, possibly a chain. The dirt nearby was clawed at, and a trail of dried blood marked its path down from the slope. "You tried to escape," Caleb whispered, "and no one came in time." A sudden gust of wind swept through. Brisket took a step back, her eyes fixed on the river. Caleb didn't know what connection tied her to the dog they had just found. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a teammate, or maybe one of the rest from the list, those silently erased without mercy. He dug a small grave beneath a pine tree, where the earth was still soft. Laying down the wool cloth from his pack, he wrapped the frozen body in the same jacket he had worn the night he saved the others from the snow. Brisket stayed inside the clearing the whole time, unmoving. When Caleb placed the last mound of earth, she bowed her head, once, then looked up again. Her eyes were clear, but dry. Caleb pulled out a small wooden plank and carved a line into it with his knife. "We heard you." Below it, he etched a simple mark, RWX7. On the walk back, Brisket didn't take the lead as she usually did. She walked in step with Caleb. Occasionally, she looked up at him. Then she'd turn back, glancing toward the woods behind them. She didn't need to say anything. Caleb understood. Brisket was not just a survivor. She was the memory of everything that had been left behind. When they reached the barn, Shield ran out to greet them, but stopped, sniffing the unfamiliar mud and cold on Brisket's coat. Scout growled low, but went silent as soon as Caleb shook his head. The dogs knew. Something had shifted. That night, as the pack lay quietly around the stove, Caleb opened his journal. His hand trembled slightly as he began to write, "What gets left behind isn't just the body. It's a piece of truth. If one of them didn't make it out, then there might be others, still out there, waiting for someone to arrive in time." He paused, looking down at Brisket curled at the foot of his bed. "And if today you led me there, then tomorrow I'll be the one who keeps going." The phone rang at exactly 2:14 a.m. Caleb opened his eyes, unsure if he was still dreaming. Inside the cold barn, there was only the sound of wind pressing against the wooden door and the steady breath of the dogs scattered across the room in deep sleep. The phone blinked faintly on the table near his bed, lighting up with a name he didn't recognize. Rachel Tran, investigative reporter. He picked it up, voice rough with sleep. "This is Caleb." A calm, composed woman's voice came through the line, not hurried, but leaving no space for hesitation. "Are you Caleb Dunn? I'm Rachel Tran. I work with an independent investigation unit called Voices Unheard. I read your piece, and I believe we need to talk. Now." Caleb sat up, his back pressed against the wall, glancing down at Brisket shifting softly by his feet. "I'm listening." This time Rachel's voice slowed, as if weighing each word carefully. "I've been following disappearance cases involving working dogs for the past 3 years. Most of them got brushed off, because technically they weren't people. But when your article came out, I cross-checked a few old entries. And you need to know this, your dogs aren't the only ones." Caleb didn't breathe. "There are at least 22 dogs, each highly trained, that vanished from official tracking systems in the past 2 years, no return records, no death notices, no transfer logs. One of them was a K-9 unit named Valor, formerly with the Bangor Police Department in Maine, retired after a mission injury, disappeared 2 months later. But here's the part I haven't told anyone. 6 of them shared the same batch code as yours, RWX7. Caleb's grip tightened around the phone. His temples throbbed. His hand instinctively reached for Brisket, like anchoring himself. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "I think there's a network behind this," Rachel replied. "An organization, or at the very least a coordinated group, using training programs as a front, then deleting records, disposing of dogs that were no longer valuable. But your group, those 7, they weren't disposed of. They were misplaced, left behind during a disrupted transfer route." Caleb closed his eyes. For a split second, he saw Ghost again, frozen by the riverbank, and the scrawled words on that kennel wall. "Don't forget us," Rachel continued. "I have a leaked internal report from 2022. It mentions a contract between Red Wind Tactical and a logistics shell company called Orion Gate. The dogs were moved by truck to what they called final performance checkpoints. But no one ever tracked what happened after that final point. If I'm right," she said slowly, "your dogs may be the only group that ever made it through alive. And if that's true, this could be the thread that unravels the entire system." Caleb leaned his head back against the pillow, eyes fixed on the raw wooden ceiling. He'd never imagined returning to flashing cameras, microphones, and case files stacked high. But now, he couldn't walk away. "What do you want from me?" he asked bluntly. "I want to come to Montana, to meet you, to meet the dogs, to record their story. You don't have to speak on record yet. But if the world is ever going to understand, this is the time." There was silence. Only the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the weighted rhythm of Caleb's breath. "You come here," he said. "I'll tell you everything. But I warn you, they're not discarded dogs anymore. They're my family." Rachel responded with just one line. "Then I will honor every story your family has to share." By the time Caleb hung up, dawn was beginning to stretch its first light through the wooden slats. He stepped outside. A fresh layer of snow had melted overnight. The air was so clear he could smell the young pines on the distant hills. Shield was the first to follow him out, lifting his head as if sensing something shifting in the air. Brisket stayed inside, but her ears twitched. Rook remained by the window, eyes fixed on the forest trail they once followed. Caleb looked over the pack and whispered, "They've heard us. This time, we speak for the ones who never got the chance." The first interview took place in the soft light of a spring morning. Rachel and her cameraman, Marcus, spent nearly 4 hours simply filming Caleb with the dogs. No pressure, no scripted questions, just letting everything unfold the way it naturally had for months. The dogs were cautious at first, but Rachel had a way about her. She didn't reach suddenly, didn't stare, didn't enter their space uninvited. And by the afternoon, Shield stepped forward and sniffed her hand. Brisket lay by her feet the whole session, still watchful, but no longer pulling away. Later, Caleb stood by the barn door when Rachel approached, holding a small laptop in her hands. "There's something you should see before we move forward," she said. He turned, calm but alert. "I found a former intern from Red Wind. He worked in the lower levels where the dogs were kept. Just handled feeding. But," she paused, pulling a small USB from her jacket. "He saved a few images. One of them is Brisket." Caleb didn't ask anything more. He plugged the drive into the laptop. The screen lit up, and his breath caught. The photo was grainy, taken from a corner surveillance cam in a dark enclosure. The resolution was poor, but it was unmistakable. Brisket. The fur was still that same pale ash gray. But Brisket had been so thin then, her bones pressing against her skin, her eyes wide to the point of breaking, not from fear, but from trying to understand how the world could be that small. Inside the iron crate, with concrete floors, there was nothing, just a cracked plastic bowl and scratch marks lining the wall. Caleb dropped to the floor, hands covering his face. He couldn't stop the tears this time. Not because the photo was too heartbreaking, but because he simply couldn't fathom that the small, curled-up creature behind him had once survived in a box that tight, that empty. Brisket walked up quietly, unsure what had happened. But sensing the trembling in Caleb's breath, she rested her head on his knee. Softly, like a touch that asked no permission. Her eyes slowly closed. Caleb said nothing. He simply ran his hand down her back, each stroke writing a silent vow in the space between them. That night, after Rachel and Marcus had returned to the inn, Caleb sat alone by the small fire. On the table lay the printed photo, freshly run through an old inkjet. He slid it into his worn notebook, just beneath a tab that read, "Brisket, the last to survive." And in that moment, he knew they had to go back. Not for vengeance, not to demand answers, but simply to say goodbye. 3 days later, the small truck was packed. Water, food, a first aid kit, a few rolled-up mats, and the new leather collars Caleb had made by hand, one for each of them, inscribed with their name and a single phrase, "Chosen to live." Shield sat in the passenger seat beside Caleb. Scout and Silent lay curled in the middle row. Rook took the back, nose pressed to the small side window, watching the world blur past. Brisket, as always, was tucked into Caleb's coat, head resting gently against his chest. The road to Redwind hadn't changed. Sharp turns, whispering pine ridges, the same rusted signpost, still leaning like it had been forgotten. But this time, Caleb wasn't coming alone. When the old steel gate creaked open, Paws touched the soil where chains once held them, where voices once broke them, where even their bark had been taken away. Scout walked slowly, almost thoughtfully, tracing old paths. Shield raised his head, nose to the wind, sensing familiar scents wrapped in time. Rook paused at the third cage, the one with numbers carved into the wall. 7.65, 3.1. Brisket didn't enter. She simply stood in front of the crate that had once confined her. Then she lifted her head and howled. Soft, short, but whole. Caleb stood beside her, hand on her back. "No one holds you here anymore. From now on, it's just a memory." He opened his backpack and pulled out the old collars, recovered from that first rescue. One by one, he hung them on each cage gate. No anger, no blame, just a quiet honoring of lives that were never given a voice. On the drive home, Caleb stopped the truck along a high ridge. From there, Redwind looked no bigger than a scratch on the forest's green skin. But to Caleb, that scar had finally healed. Shield slept with his head tilted toward the window. Scout was out cold. Rook leaned against the frame. And Brisket, for the first time ever, rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. He turned to her, smiling. "Thank you for showing me the way." The next morning, the sun rose earlier than usual. Its first rays cut through the tall pines, melting the dew from the needles above. And for the first time in months, the snow didn't fall. Caleb stood in front of the old grounds, once the Redwind training facility. Now, all that remained were broken concrete slabs, a few leaning walls, and the scent of time slipping by untouched. But today, the place didn't feel cold anymore. Because across the cracked foundation, the dogs ran free, not by number, not by command, not to earn praise, but simply because they could. Scout led the charge, darting past what used to be staircases, hopping over rubble as if he were chasing treasure. Shield ambled behind him like a veteran guard, eyes sweeping the horizon, watching over a new kind of home. Rook, usually quiet, barked once, sharp and sudden, when he picked up a scent near the wall. Bruiser bumped his shoulder into a fallen iron beam, then dropped to the ground, rolling as if to say, "Just once more, let me remember the fight." Silent lay in the middle of the yard, once the central training square, eyes half closed, finally soaking in the kind of peace he'd never known. And Brisket? She walked, lightly, slowly, but deeply. She didn't race. She didn't jump. She simply walked room to room, pausing at each doorway as if whispering farewell to the ghosts that once stayed behind. Caleb didn't call her. He simply watched. In his hand was a worn black notebook, the same one he'd found in Redwind's basement during their earlier return. Inside were pages, codes, notes, performance scores, and dismissals. Each line clinical, cold, detached from the reality that every code once had a heart that beat, a tail that wagged, and eyes that longed to be seen. He flipped to the last page. Only one line remained. X7, lost. Caleb closed the book. He pulled out a lighter from his pocket. Then, kneeling in the center of what used to be a place of orders and sirens and broken obedience, he placed the notebook on the ground. The flame caught quickly. It licked at the edges of the frayed leather cover, then devoured page after page of numbers that never told the truth. The dogs stopped. No one called them, but they all turned and watched. Silently. Then Caleb stood, turning to face each of them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't chant or cheer. He simply walked up, one by one, kneeling slightly, and gently touching each of their collars as if performing a quiet rite known only to them. To Shield, he said, "You were the shield. Now you're the guardian of freedom." To Scout, "You led the way. Now you lead your own." To Silent, "No more commands. From now on, just live." To Bruiser, "You don't have to be strong anymore. You're allowed to be soft." To Rook, "Thank you for waiting. Now you get to choose." And to Brisket, Caleb sat all the way down, bringing his forehead to hers, whispering, "I'm sorry I didn't get to you sooner, but from today on, no one can ever cage you again." He lifted his head, looking at them, all of them now gathered around him. "You're free now." A soft wind stirred, picking up the last flecks of ash from the still warm notebook fire. The ashes floated down onto the courtyard, the same courtyard once worn thin by forced footsteps and echoed commands. But today, there were only joyful paws, the occasional bark, and wind weaving through broken window frames, like reopening a place that had been sealed for too long. On the road back, Caleb drove slower than usual. Shield was breathing softly in the passenger seat. Brisket curled quietly in his arms, asleep, deeply this time. And for the first time, Caleb didn't feel like he was dragging them through a painful past. He was helping them finish a chapter, so they could finally begin a new one. When Caleb stepped onto the small wooden stage erected in Redstone's public square, the morning sun had just broken through the clouds after a night of gentle rain. The wind wasn't cold. It brushed past like a silent pat on the shoulder. In front of him were a few neat rows of chairs, not many, but filled with the right people. A handful of local reporters, a few television crews, animal welfare volunteers, and townsfolk from every corner. No spotlights, no boom mics, just a single microphone and a quiet speaker. But every eye wasn't fixed on Caleb. They were watching something else entirely, something stepping up from behind him. The dogs. Scout emerged first, as always, ears tall, taking in this new scent of freedom. Shield walked right beside Caleb, his gait proud, his eyes scanning the area like a veteran watching over home. Rook followed, slow but no longer timid. Silent sat beneath the podium, directly under the beam of sunlight, as if he'd known that was his place all along. And Brisket, no bark, no wagging tail, simply stepped forward, lifting her head to face the crowd. Caleb said nothing at first. He didn't read from notes, didn't recount the stories he'd written in the margins of sleepless nights. He just leaned into the mic and spoke in a quiet, grounded voice. Not dramatic, just real. I could say a lot about the days they were left behind, about the cages, the codes, the system, but if you need just one reason to believe, then please look into their eyes. He turned to Brisket, the smallest one, once locked inside a crate barely bigger than a drawer. He raised his hand with a subtle signal, the kind they'd all once been trained to respond to. Brisket stepped beside Rook, curled up gently. Rook nudged her back with his nose. A female journalist quietly raised her phone to film. A young boy in the front row gripped his backpack tighter, staring silently at Bruiser, who had flopped down like a tired uncle at the end of a long journey. Caleb continued. They don't speak, but every scar, every flinch at a sudden sound, every guarded glance, those are stories, proof of what was done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a copy of the report he'd written months ago, but never submitted. He placed it on the lectern and tapped it once. I won't read it aloud. I'll let you investigate, write the rest. My job was to bring them here, so those who needed to see could see. And then, something Caleb never expected happened. Not a barrage of questions, not protest, not even silence, but applause. Slow at first, one clap, then two, then all at once. No cheering, no shouting, just a wave of quiet clapping that filled the square, not for him, but for the lives sitting patiently beneath him. Scout startled a little but didn't run. Shield lifted his head higher, eyes glassy. And Brisket, for the first time in front of strangers, wagged her tail. After the event, a middle-aged woman approached, hands shaking as she held out a knitted scarf. My husband served with a K-9. He's gone now. But that one? She pointed to Shield. That look in his eyes? It's the same. Thank you for not letting them be forgotten. A family from the neighboring town brought a sack of food and warm blankets. A high school student held up a handmade sign that read, "Injustice toward a species that knows how to sacrifice is injustice toward us all." And in the days that followed, Caleb's wordless speech spread, not through persuasion, but through presence, through the simple, undeniable existence of beings who had nearly been erased. News headlines read, Caleb Dunn, the man who didn't speak, but let the dogs tell the truth. A social media page had just been launched. RWX7 Survivors. Within 24 hours, it had more than 100,000 followers. That night, Caleb sat in the old storage barn by the fire. Scout rested his head on Caleb's lap. Rook had his chin propped on the wooden leg of the chair. And Brisket, as always, was curled up at Caleb's side, breathing slow, steady, safe. He no longer wrote in his journal, but this time he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a sentence on the wooden board nailed to the center of the wall. No need for words. If you're still here, that's enough to tell the story. 7 weeks after the public gathering, Caleb paused at his front gate, stunned at what the place had become. No more splintered planks, no more sagging metal patched with plastic sheets, no more crumbling bricks washed away by storm water. The old barn, once a last resort shelter on that snowy night, had transformed into a modest rescue center, bearing a name Caleb had come up with in a sleepless hour. The Forgotten Seven. The hand-carved wooden sign swung from the metal gate, its letters rough but strong. Beneath it, written in Caleb's own hand, where no living soul gets left behind. The renovation hadn't been fast, but everything had arrived right on time. After the story spread, donations to Rachel's site exceeded every expectation. Veterans who once served with K-9s, families who'd lost beloved pets, and even strangers who had never owned a dog but had been deeply moved, all contributed. A local construction company volunteered to rebuild the roof and install new wiring. A group of vet students drove over 200 miles from the next state to help set up medical equipment. And one elderly artisan, nearly 70, didn't say much. He simply sent 7 small wooden plaques, each bearing a name: Shield, Scout, Silent, Rook, Bruiser, Brisket, Ghost. Caleb never referred to the place as a shelter, and he couldn't bring himself to call it a training center. He preferred one word: home. A place with warm light, the scent of pine wood, barks that weren't shushed, and corners each soul could call their own. Each dog had a spacious kennel with thick wool rugs and a window that welcomed the morning sun. Each space had its own name, its own food bowl, and a little toy, a small thing they never had before. But the part that moved Caleb most wasn't in the new paint or polished floors. It was the nights, when the dogs dragged their beds to the center of the room and curled up against one another, like wild creatures who had survived a cruel winter and now only needed warmth to feel alive. Brisket always curled up in the middle. Scout slung a leg across Rook. Shield rested his chin near Silent's paws. And Bruiser, he never slept in the right spot. He'd just roll and sprawl like a tiny king in a crowded palace. Caleb had once tried placing beds inside each kennel and shutting the gates for the night, but every time he'd find them all standing silently behind the bars, not sad, just waiting. And that's when he knew. They didn't want to be alone anymore. From then on, every gate stayed open. Absolute freedom. Each morning, Caleb would brew his coffee and sit on the porch, watching the pack stretch and stir. None of them rushed. Scout would dash out first, sniffing every corner of the yard like it was brand new. Shield moved in slow patrols, checking the planks like a seasoned guard. Brisket always came last, but she'd follow Caleb's every step once he stepped outside. Caleb pinned photos to the wall of the common room, one from their first day, one in the snow, one of Ghost by the riverbank. And in the center he framed a quote that read, "Here, living isn't just instinct, it's a choice." Every weekend, people from town came by with their kids, not to see dogs, but to visit survivors. Children ran across the field, shouting names they now knew by heart. One little girl, no more than 5, once tugged Caleb's sleeve and asked, "Mister, can Brisket smile?" Caleb knelt beside her, gently petting Brisket's back, and whispered, "She does something even better. She forgives." One afternoon, while scrubbing the floors, Caleb heard the small sound of sneakers approaching. A young boy walked up shyly, holding out a small package wrapped in newspaper. "My mom said to give this to you," the boy mumbled, "because you helped the ones who couldn't speak." Inside the wrapping was a green rubber bracelet, embossed across the band, "I bark for those who couldn't." That evening, as Brisket rested beside him on the steps, Caleb slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. "You know," he whispered, voice nearly lost in the quiet air, "I think we really do have a home now." Brisket didn't respond, but she looked up to the sky where snow no longer fell, and in her clear, glistening eyes, the starlight gently reflected something unspoken, as if to say, "At last, I've been called by my real name." The snow from the night before had left only a thin blanket, soft as a shawl draped over Redstone's shoulders after a long dream. The air wasn't cold, just crisp, pure in a way that made you want to breathe deeper. The whole town felt still, as if listening not to words or voices, but to the sound of snow touching rooftops, pine branches. And something deeper still, the quiet place in every heart where hope waits to be heard. In the small courtyard of the Forgotten 7, the dogs were already up and moving. Scout darted around the yard, a blue wool scarf tied around his neck. a gift from a little girl named Ellie from the next town over. Shield stuck to his routine, checking each kennel corner before taking his post by the front gate, like a silent sentry. Bruiser was mock growling at Silent, locked in their usual who can bark louder game. And Rook lay quietly on the porch, waiting for the first rays of sunlight to stretch across the wood. Only Brisket sat curled up in the far corner, ears alert, eyes fixed on the distance, just as always. Caleb stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The vapor swirled into the early morning mist. He wore a worn brown sweater and a thin silk scarf, his birthday gift from his elderly mother, sent from across the state. His gaze never left Brisket. Then came the sound of the gate creaking open. Small footsteps entered, canvas shoes dusted with snow, a deep red coat with teddy bear ears on the hood. It was little Mia, 6 years old, the girl who once sobbed when she first met Bruiser because he looked like a bear, but not scary at all. Today, Mia had come alone. No mother walking beside her like before. One hand held a small rubber ball. The other fumbled with the gate latch. Brisket turned her head. Her eyes widened. Her body tensed, not in fear but in focus. And what happened next made even Caleb stop breathing. Brisket stood up. She didn't back away. She didn't slink behind the wooden crates like she usually did. Instead, Brisket stepped forward, slow, deliberate, toward Mia. Mia sat down and held out the ball, saying nothing. A breeze lifted a few strands of her reddish-brown hair, brushing them gently across her forehead. And then, for the first time since that blizzard night, Brisket barked. It was short. It wasn't loud or eager, but it was clear, full, unmistakable. "I'm here." Scout froze mid-run. Shield lifted his head. Silent turned. One by one, every dog stopped, and then, as if called by instinct, they each began moving toward Brisket, as if to say, "We heard you." Mia beamed, her cheeks flushed with joy. She gently placed the ball on the ground and reached out to pet Brisket's back. No hesitation. And Brisket didn't pull away. She didn't retreat. She lay down right in front of the little girl, resting her head across those tiny legs, eyes closing in quiet peace. On the porch, Caleb tightened his grip on the coffee mug. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching the moment unfold, like he feared it might vanish if he blinked, like breath dissolving into snow. Every memory, driving through storms, wiping blood from Paws, the fever nights nursing Rook, the haunting image of Ghost by the riverbank, all of it melted away in that thin layer of snow falling again. But this time, it no longer felt cold. Caleb whispered, barely louder than the wind, maybe to himself, or to someone he once loved. "I didn't save you. You saved me." A little while later, Caleb stepped down into the yard. The dogs gathered around Mia, who was now chatting away, her hand stroking Brisket's ear as she told stories from school. Bruiser lay belly up, inviting belly rubs. Shield stood behind her like a guardian made of shadows. Caleb sat beside Brisket, his hand running gently down her back. Then he turned to Mia. "Brisket spoke today, because of you." The girl nodded firmly, her eyes glowing with conviction. "I knew it. Sometimes, we just need someone to believe in us." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Rook, standing by the door, and said softly, "Ready. It's time we take one more step forward." The story of Caleb and the Forgotten Seven wasn't just a tale of survival, of 7 German shepherds who endured a storm. It was a quiet but profound reminder. Sometimes, the smallest lives teach us the biggest lessons about love, trust, and forgiveness. These German shepherds, famous for loyalty, intelligence, and sacrifice, had once been discarded like broken tools. Yet through the hands of a man who'd nearly lost all faith in life, they weren't just saved. They were reborn. And in doing so, they rekindled a part of humanity many had forgotten still existed. From that first glance under a sheet of snow, to Brisket's first bark, to the home named the Forgotten Seven, every moment was proof that every life, no matter how wounded or silent, deserves to be loved, to be seen, and to truly live. We don't always need to do something grand to change the world. Sometimes, all it takes is stopping your truck on a frozen night and kneeling down with compassion. Because somewhere out there, eyes are still waiting to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, like Caleb, in saving a life, you'll end up saving your own. A lonely man hears a faint cry coming from the frozen lake. When he follows the sound, what he finds is not only a small German shepherd dog on the brink of death, but also a painful memory buried deep in his heart. Can this life-saving act heal a heart that has been frozen for years? What really happened under the ice? The wind sliced through the dead branches lining Blackridge Lake, hurling snow across the surface like pale ashes tossed from an unseen hand. It was January 1997, and Echo Pines lay buried under one of the harshest winters in memory, the lake crusted over in a thick layer of ice, like opaque glass sealing away forgotten grief. Everything was still. The only sound was the wind threading through the naked pines, moaning like a sorrow that never got the chance to be spoken aloud. Amid the blank expanse of white, something shifted, barely, a trembling movement brushing across the ice. Fragile, weak. A tiny creature clung to the surface, soaked and shivering, struggling with each unsteady step. It was a German shepherd pup, no more than 4 weeks old, ribs stark beneath its wet fur, spine curled tight against the cold. Each of its tiny paws slipped with every movement, limbs quaking as they pressed against the unforgiving slickness. The puppy staggered forward, aimless, its round black eyes wide and searching for warmth in a place that had long forgotten the word. Specks of blood marked its cracked paw pads, vanishing into the snow like breath in the wind, unnoticed, erased. Crack! A sharp sound split the stillness, crisp and hollow, like a bone snapping in the silence. The ice beneath the pup shuddered. It froze, eyes wide, breath hitched. And then, crack! The ice tore apart, a jagged scream of sound and rupture as a jagged mouth opened in the lake. Freezing black water surged up like it had been waiting to swallow, to claim. The tiny body slipped through, swallowed whole. The sound echoed once. Then silence. No one heard. No one, except one man. Thomas Grady sat on the west bank, on the same old wooden bench where he used to take his daughter fishing every weekend before the world had changed. He was 45 now. Weathered lines carved his face, and his salt and pepper hair whipped quietly in the wind. His heavy coat couldn't keep out the cold he carried inside. The same cold that had settled in 8 years earlier, when Emily disappeared beneath this very ice. Each winter he returned, not to fish, not really, but to wait. For what, he never knew. A miracle, maybe. Or just a sound that might make him remember she was real. That day, like all the others before it, Thomas sat motionless, eyes vacant and distant, until he heard it. A whimper. Faint, ragged, but it clawed at him like invisible fingers pulling from the dark. He stiffened. He leaned forward, listening, eyes scanning the lake's surface. Another whimper, softer, shattered, but real, He stood too fast. His knees buckled slightly beneath the rush of adrenaline. His eyes locked towards the northeastern shore, where the lake opened wide like a shattered mirror. Far out, a tiny shape, grayish-brown, floundered in the middle of a widening pool of black water. No, not again. Thomas ran. His boots punched through snow. His coat flapped behind him like a warning flag in the wind. His breath came fast, not from the cold, but from panic, the kind that whispered, "Not again, not again, not again." He didn't hesitate at the lake's edge. He dropped to his knees and began crawling across the ice, spreading his weight across arms and elbows. The cold cut through his coat, straight to his bones, but he didn't slow. Every crack beneath his elbows made him flinch, but he kept going. And ahead of him, the image of a tiny pup flailing in icy water blurred into a memory. Emily's face, just before she vanished under the ice, her smile frozen in time, her hand slipping below the surface. Not this time. 3 meters. 2. 1. The ice groaned beneath his chest, creaking a warning. He didn't care. "You hold on, little one." Thomas's voice rasped out, breaking the silence he'd kept for months. He reached into the water, his arm disappearing into the freezing dark. His fingers touched soaked fur. The puppy twitched, then went limp. Thomas braced and pulled. Upper. Water burst upward as he yanked the small body from the lake, cradling it against his chest. He rolled onto his back on the ice, panting hard, heart hammering like war drums. Then, there it was. A faint sound. A heartbeat, not just his. Something fragile and fluttering beat against his chest. The puppy. It was alive. Thomas lay there for minutes, letting the cold settle into his coat, into his bones, but never into his heart. Not now. Not with this heartbeat whispering against him. He got up slowly, gathering the shivering pup into his arms. He walked back through the snow, each step careful, steady, sure. In his arms, the little German shepherd was curled tight, tiny ears trembling, eyes closed, breath thin like gossamer threads. But it was breathing. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt something stirring in his chest. Not sorrow, not regret, but life. And a single aching question rose in him as he stepped into the trees, holding the fragile bundle close. Who had left it there, alone, on that frozen, merciless lake? The path to the cabin wound like a crack through the snowbound forest, between trees heavy with frost, limbs bare and rattling. The wind hissed overhead, whistling through needles and dry branches, carrying a sound like the soft clack of old bones, like distant voices echoing from a place where time no longer mattered. And beneath Thomas's labored footsteps was another rhythm, soft, faint, but steady, the fragile breath of the creature in his arms, as if the tiniest lapse would let it be claimed by the winter once more. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, cold ash, and time left untouched. Dust hung in golden shafts of light filtering through frosted windows, casting the room in the kind of stillness only grief could build. Thomas knelt on the wooden floor and gently placed the pup onto an old wool blanket, rolled into a makeshift nest. His hands that had grown used to tools, stone, silence, shook as they touched the damp fur and chilled skin. He didn't know what to do next. It had been too long since he'd taken care of anything alive. Too long since any other heartbeat, but his had lived in this place. But the eyes, half shut, lashes dusted with snow, breath ragged and shallow, held him in place. He couldn't just watch. He threw off his wet coat, reached for dry logs and struck a match for the first time in months. Not for cooking, not for himself, but for this life. The flame caught, crackled, glowed, and for the first time in a long, long winter, the silence inside that old cabin broke, and something began to thaw. Scout, the name had not yet been spoken aloud, had not yet been uttered into existence, and yet it had already begun to settle, almost imperceptibly, into the quiet folds of his heart. Let out a faint, barely there sound, like a whisper of thread-thin breath tugged straight from the cold bowels of the earth and strung taut to the center of his being. Thomas turned back, knelt down, and with a dry cloth began gently brushing away the snow clinging to the small dog's body. Its fur, though still matted and rough, had begun to dry from the faint warmth radiating from the fireplace, and though still heartbreakingly thin, the little body had ceased its violent shivers. The tiny ears twitched ever so slightly as his hand moved slowly, awkwardly, yet with unrelenting care, down the dog's spine. Each stroke a humble gesture, hesitant and human. Thomas felt a weight gather in his chest, not the heaviness of sorrow, but something else, something strange, unspoken, as if a corner of himself, long silent and sealed off, was being quietly cleansed by the soft, tentative breaths of this fragile life. The dog opened its eyes, wide, wet, clouded with cold, yet flickering with a question that trembled just beneath the surface. It did not bark, did not whimper, only stared at him. A gaze that seemed to ask, not with fear, but with trembling hope, "Have I really been saved?" Thomas sank down to the floor, back resting against the worn arm of the old chair, arms folded loosely across his knees. In the flickering light of the fire, his face began to soften, no longer held in that habitual distance, no longer the mask of someone who had long ago stopped letting himself feel. There remained only a gaze, slow and gentle, lowered slightly, as though for the first time in a long time he was facing life in its most fragile, most honest form. By his feet, the small creature shifted slightly, nestling its head closer to his leg, front paws tucked in, tail trembling faintly as it brushed against the cold wooden floor. Thomas felt the frail warmth returning, not just to the dog, but to himself, seeping from that tiny frame, through his skin and into his chest, into the place that had frozen the day Emily's small hand slipped from his on the lake. No one spoke. No sound came, except the whistle of wind through the doorframe and the quiet crackle of wood splitting in the fire. But in that stillness something had been formed, delicate as breath, deep as roots, steady as a flame that does not seek a name. And then, in the dust-laden room still bearing the traces of time and memory, Thomas said it, not loudly, not clearly, but with a quiet sincerity that hung in the air like a promise. "You're here now." Behind him, the small glass window was fogged over with condensation. But if someone were outside, watching, they would see the fire glowing within, and in its glow a man who had once lost everything, now resting his hand upon a life that had just come back from the edge. And beneath his feet, where the old blanket had been folded into a makeshift bed, a small movement stirred. Scout had lifted its head, just slightly, eyes half closed, mouth releasing a sigh, as if it were whispering its very first words to a world it had never known. And Thomas, in that moment, had no idea. That very look, that very breath, would become the thread leading him out of the longest winter of his life, toward something his heart had long forgotten how to seek. As the wind whispered still beyond the window panes, Thomas rose again, slow and deliberate, and poured a little warm water into the chipped ceramic bowl. Scout remained curled beneath the blanket, but when he placed the bowl down, those small ears flicked, and a damp little nose cautiously poked out from beneath the folds. The movements were weak, hesitant, but unmistakably alive, life relearning its own rhythm. Thomas sat beside him, one hand steadying the bowl, the other gently tracing down Scout's back. There was nothing more to say, only the presence of two souls that had collided and found each other on a day so cold it seemed carved from silence. When Scout had drifted back into sleep, now deeper, calmer, Thomas finally looked more closely at the dog's neck. When he had lifted it from the ice, he had thought only of keeping it alive, not of examining anything else. But now, under the soft, golden light of the fire, he saw it, a thin strip of leather wrapped around Scout's neck, a collar worn and faded, the edge of the strap frayed, and the metal buckle scratched and dulled by time. Thomas leaned in, parting the fur gently. On the collar hung a small metal tag, round, tarnished, its surface dusted and crusted with remnants of old snow. He pulled out his handkerchief, slowly wiping away the grime. Gradually, letters emerged. A phone number. But the last two digits were nearly rubbed away, only faint traces of their shapes lingering in a blur of metal and memory. He sat in silence for a while, the tag catching the firelight in his palm. A feeling settled inside him, not sorrow, not dread, but something uncannily familiar, like a tune half remembered. A small dog, no signs of abandonment, wearing a collar, carrying a tag. Wasn't it true that only creatures once loved by someone could carry such things? Thomas stood, pulled open the wooden drawer, and retrieved the old cell phone he still used. Thick and heavy, the kind only those who traveled far kept around. After a moment's calculation, he picked what he believed were the two most likely final digits and began to dial. Beep, beep. No answer. He tried again, with another combination, and then another. Once it rang 4 times before cutting to silence. Another time, the system replied, "Number does not exist." As if the one fragile thread he'd held on to had slipped through his fingers like smoke in the winter air. Thomas returned to his seat, phone resting beside him on the table, fingers tapping the wood. A quiet rhythm, unconscious, as he drifted into thought. The wind outside howled a little louder, pushing through the cracks in the door, while inside only the soft fire remained, and the quiet, steady breathing of Scout. What filled his mind then was not frustration nor confusion, but a gentle sort of wonder, tender and nameless, like a child stumbling upon a torn piece of a map deep in the woods behind the house, and somehow sensing that this piece belonged to something greater. And though the path was unclear, the child knew, with some buried certainty, that they must follow it. Scout, a name never yet called aloud but already so familiar to his inner ear, was not simply a stray. Nothing about its arrival felt like chance. And that, perhaps, was why Thomas remained there for so long, eyes never leaving the worn metal tag on the table, next to the phone still glowing faintly in the light. Scout shifted slightly in his makeshift nest, letting out a soft whimper before nestling his head deeper into the woolen blanket. Thomas smiled faintly, rising to his feet and moving toward the window, his back bathed in the warm amber glow spilling from the fireplace. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent, the sky heavy and gray. Yet inside, Thomas felt a clarity growing stronger than any winter dawn before, as if a light was slowly breaking through the long-held shadows within him. Quietly, he fetched more firewood and fed the flames, then settled down on the floor, leaning against the worn chair with a long, steady breath. His eyes flicked again toward the name tag resting nearby, as if afraid to forget some vital detail. Maybe tomorrow morning, he thought, he would try calling once more. Maybe he would take the collar into town, ask around if anyone had ever seen it before. Or perhaps he would simply stay here one more night, tending the fire, waiting for Scout to regain strength and allowing himself to listen more closely than he had in years, to the slow but steady beat of his own heart coming back to life. But when dawn finally slipped through the frosted window pane, pale and fragile, it roused Thomas earlier than usual. The sun offered little warmth, yet its mere presence, soft and tentative, was enough to stir something deep inside him, whispering that today might be the day to step beyond the worn boundary between himself and the world. Scout remained weak, but his eyes opened wider. His legs, though still trembling and unsteady, moved with effort each time Thomas's footsteps passed nearby. The way Scout struggled just to lift his chin onto the edge of the blanket, as if to watch him go, cracked something deep within Thomas's chest, a softening that no winter chill could touch. Carefully, Thomas placed Scout inside an old wooden box lined with soft cloths, wrapped in several layers of woolen sweaters, and secured it to the passenger seat of his battered pickup truck. The engine rumbled to life with a hoarse cough, wind whistling through cracked windows, and cold creeping through every gap in his clothing. Yet Thomas barely noticed. Scout lay still, eyes heavy, breath shallow, but the pulse at his ankle grew steadier, more determined, as if Thomas's presence alone was rekindling something the pup had almost lost. The road to town was short but slow, covered with fresh snow from the night before. The truck's tires slipped once or twice when turning onto the main street. The Echo Pines sign, half covered in frost, blinked faintly by the roadside, while the town itself remained as quiet as any other winter, snow blanketing every roof, doors firmly shut, and streets mostly empty. Martha's pet haven stood on a small corner near the bakery, its pale blue wooden facade adorned with painted paw prints and soft, warm fairy lights still glowing faintly through the glass. Thomas parked right in front, lifted the box holding Scout, and stepped inside, the tinkling bell announcing an unfamiliar visitor. Martha looked up from wiping down the counter. A woman in her early 30s, her brown hair hastily tied back, eyes sharp yet kind, the kind of person you trusted from the first glance. Her brow furrowed slightly upon seeing Thomas, but softened when it fell to the box in his arms, her face changing instantly. "Oh my God, what is this?" Martha's voice was low but clear as she hurried closer and crouched to look at Scout. "He fell into Blackridge Lake," Thomas explained quietly, setting the box on the wooden counter. "I pulled him out, kept him warm overnight, and brought him here, hoping you might know something." Martha didn't answer right away. She squatted down and gently touched Scout's ear. A soft, careful gesture that spoke of 100 such moments, yet still held reverence for every fragile life. She moved her hand to his neck but froze when she saw the worn leather collar. "Did you see a name tag?" she asked, voice suddenly serious. Thomas nodded, pulling the tag from his jacket pocket and placing it on the counter. "The numbers faded. I tried calling some numbers, but no one answered." Martha took it, rubbing her fingers lightly over the dull metal, her brow knitting tighter. A long silence stretched between them before she looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze with something heavier now, concern or maybe caution, mingled with sympathy. "I've seen this collar before." Thomas's heart clenched. His hand gripped the edge of the counter. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "Not this exact one, but collars like this, tags like these. In the past 2 months, at least 3 people have come in asking about lost German Shepherd puppies. They all described collars just like this. Their dogs vanished without a trace. 1 from north of town, 2 from farms about 10 miles out." She paused, speaking deliberately. "And all of them disappeared. Exactly this breed." The words fell between them like a heavy stone, sinking silently into still water. Thomas said nothing at first, lowering his gaze to Scout, eyes half closed, breathing steady, his small ear twitching at a noise. A creature that seemed fragile, yet now the center of something far larger. "What do you think?" Thomas asked softly, almost a whisper. Martha sat up straight, sliding the tag into a drawer before pouring Thomas a cup of hot tea. Steam fogged her glasses, but behind them, her eyes had changed. Serious, guarded, touched with something close to compassion. "I think Scout didn't just happen to appear on that lake." On the counter, the blanket lining the box shifted slightly as Scout, though weak, tried to turn his head, eyes opening a sliver as if searching for a familiar voice. Thomas bent down quickly, resting his large hand gently on the pup's head, feeling the faint warmth fluttering beneath his palm. In that fragile moment, caught between life's precarious edge and the growing unease in his heart, Thomas realized he was no longer just an observer. Martha rose, moved behind the counter, and pulled from the bottom drawer a thin folder, worn at the edges, filled with handwritten notes, grainy photocopied images, and several local newspaper clippings, their pages yellowed with age and time. She laid the collection down in front of Thomas, her eyes betraying a guarded tension that even her steady tone could not conceal. "I gathered these from a handful of customers, from acquaintances who work at the Wildlife Rescue Center, and from one of the delivery drivers who regularly passes through the old industrial sector north of town," Martha began, flipping through the pages slowly, deliberately. "They said they've heard dogs barking at night from inside those abandoned warehouses. One even mentioned seeing flickers of flashlight beams. But by the time the police arrived, there was never anyone left to find." Thomas turned a few pages. The images were blurred, stripped of clarity by old scanners and bad lighting. Just endless rows of corrugated iron structures, brick walls split with cracks, metal shutters pulled unevenly, faint tire tracks in the snow, and a barbed wire fence with jagged, crudely cut openings. Nothing conclusive, nothing definitive. And yet something about them made a chill crawl along his spine. Not from cold, but from instinct. "What would they want with the dogs?" he asked softly, almost not expecting an answer. "There are theories," Martha said, her voice low but steady. "They target purebreds, easier to sell, especially shepherds. Maybe for breeding. Maybe for illegal training. There are even rumors of a camp across the border, unlicensed, underground, where dogs are conditioned for darker purposes." A sharp gust screamed against the glass pane, lifting one of the papers on the table just enough to make it tremble, as if in mute agreement. Beneath the table, Scout let out a faint whimper, legs twitching in a dream, or perhaps remembering something it couldn't yet name. Thomas lifted his teacup, but didn't drink. His eyes remained fixed on one photograph, a rusted warehouse door caught in the yellow light of a distant flood lamp. The snow beneath it melted in uneven blotches like footprints not yet gone. "Do we know who's behind it?" he asked. Martha shook her head. "Only one name comes up again and again, Darren Vicks, but no one has any proof. He's been suspected before, exotic animals, black market sales, but nothing ever stuck. Now it seems he's shifted focus. Dogs, the good ones, working breeds, shepherds mostly." Thomas sat in silence, leaning slightly forward, fingers laced together. The name meant nothing to his memory, and yet carried with it the echo of something uncomfortably real, not from his own past, but from within Scout's eyes, where the fear had not yet learned how to bark. "We have to do something," he said, the words drawn out, heavy with meaning. Martha studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the gravity of what was being asked, or what it might demand of them both. Then she nodded slowly. "I can come with you. I've done volunteer work with the rescue unit before. I know how to track. But if we go, You have to know this won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Thomas looked down at Scout, the small dog curled in his blanket, still trembling, head buried beneath the folds. Something so frail, and yet it had made his heart feel braver than it had in years, perhaps because it had survived. And perhaps, in its exhausted sleep, it mirrored something in himself that he had long refused to acknowledge. "Scout comes with us," he said, not as a command, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Martha frowned slightly. "Are you sure?" "He's still weak." "But he needs to know he won't be left behind again," Thomas answered, his gaze never leaving the dog. That afternoon, as the snow began to fall thicker and faster, they left Pet Haven, heading towards the old industrial district. In the vehicle, Scout was wrapped tightly in extra layers, nestled between the two of them, his head resting against Thomas's shoulder. For the first time since leaving the cabin, he made no sound. As if some primal instinct within him understood that this journey, unlike all those before, was not an abandonment, but a return, a search for something lost. The road leading to the warehouse grounds was barren. No signs, no lights, just the fading tracks of old tires and the skeletal trees swaying like whispers in the wind. The vehicle stopped at a fork cloaked in thick ice, just far enough to glimpse the weathered brick walls in the distance. "We can't go in today," Martha said, "but we can watch. Every 30 minutes or so, my team and I have seen a car pass through. Not many, but enough to suggest a pattern." Thomas gazed into the distance, where the winter sunset spilled amber light across rusted metal frames and snow-laced roofs. Something was there. Not overt, not obvious, but not hiding either. Scout stirred, nudging his head into Thomas's palm. A small movement, but enough to bring warmth back into the cramped vehicle, despite the cold pressing in all around. The wind cut low and hard across the barren field, dragging with it the sound of rustling dead leaves and the hollow clatter of metal sheets straining against forgotten rooftops. Martha lowered the window just slightly, allowing the scent of rust and wet snow to slip inside. She raised the binoculars, her eyes scanning the still silhouette of the warehouse row before them. "There," she whispered, pointing with a subtle tilt of her hand. "Warehouse 4, the roll-up door. It was open yesterday. Now it's been pulled back down, but not all the way. There's a gap left." Thomas squinted, peering through the fading light. On the pale stretch of snow before the door, a sequence of faint, oblong depressions stretched forward, small, uniform, not human, a clean line of tracks, fast but focused. They were paw prints. Both stepped out of the car. Scout, now wrapped in Martha's spare coat, looked stronger, his eyes wide and ears alert. The moment the door clicked open, he inhaled sharply, then lunged slightly out of Thomas's arms. The snow startled him, but he didn't recoil. Instead, his head dipped low, nose sweeping the ground, a behavior so instinctive it felt like muscle memory. "Wait," Martha whispered, eyes locked on the little dog. "Do you see that?" Thomas remained silent, yet within him, the change was undeniable. Scout's eyes were no longer heavy with exhaustion or searching blindly. Instead, they held a strange, focused intensity, sweeping over the space before him as the puppy's head tilted slightly, ears perked high, nose twitching softly in the cold air. Then, suddenly, Scout whipped his head sharply to the left, toward a wall overgrown with dead vines and a shattered window frame. "There's something in the wind," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "And it's remembering." The three of them moved closer, each step cautious, snow packed thick beneath their feet, ice lurking slick and hidden, and the wind carrying faint breaths from within those forgotten walls. Scout led the way. His gait, though still weak, was purposeful, resolute. Reaching the broken window, Scout stopped. No bark, no growl, just stillness, nose pressed to the narrow gap, inhaling deeply. Then, without warning, he sat rigid, back stiff, ears drooping slightly, a reaction born not of fear, but of alertness. Thomas and Martha approached together. He crouched to peer inside. The fading daylight filtered through cracks, casting light on scattered objects cloaked in shadow. A chain, a metal bowl, a tattered piece of fabric lining. At the corner, empty wooden crates. But what caught Thomas's breath was the dried blood, dark and spreading in a streak along the wall's edge. "They used to keep dogs here," Martha said, her voice dropping low. "But they've moved out now." Thomas said nothing, only standing quietly, watching Scout, whose gaze remained fixed on the darkened room as if recalling something, hearing a sound beyond human reach, a faint groan echoing from deep within memory, a presence living only in silence. "Maybe they'll come back," Thomas murmured, eyes never leaving the broken frame. "They're in no rush to erase the traces. The chains remain, food's still there. It's like they just pulled out for now." Martha nodded. "We can't do anything yet, no solid proof, but if we catch them at the right time—" Scout suddenly stepped back, eyes still locked on the room, then turned to Thomas, his look a silent urging, not pleading but inviting. "We need to watch," Thomas said, his voice steady as if affirming the path he had already decided. Martha agreed. "I'll call some people from the rescue team. We can take shifts keeping guard. If anyone comes in after dark, we'll have cameras ready." Thomas bent down, lifted Scout gently into his arms, the small body still fragile but steady beneath his touch. Outside, snow began falling thicker, each flake landing cold against his cheek, but the warmth cradled between his arms, the faint heartbeat, gave him one certain truth. This was far from over. Before leaving the warehouse district, Thomas glanced back. The sun had slipped behind the mountains, painting the horizon deep purple and red. The broken door hung ajar like an old eye unwilling to close. The next morning, echo pines lay wrapped in mist and silent gray snow. The sunlight filtered weakly through thick clouds, casting icy streets in a frozen stillness that seemed to suspend time itself. Thomas drove straight to the police station. Martha sat beside him, holding Scout close, the dog nestled obediently into her coat, eyes watchful but no longer frantic like the first day. The station was modest, a worn, two-story red brick building resting at the heart of Main Street, its faded wooden sign reading Echo Pines Police Department, peeling with age. Inside, the scent of cold coffee and faint ink mingled in the air, creating the familiar atmosphere of a place that never truly sleeps, always ready for a midnight call. The duty sergeant ushered them to a back room where Chief Sam Ridley sat reading files, steel-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, stirring his steaming coffee absently. Sam was in his 50s, solid and broad-shouldered, hair graying short, his neatly trimmed beard framing deep brown eyes that carried a steady, guarded hardness. When Thomas entered, Sam looked up briefly, a glance lacking warmth but quick to assess. "Thomas Grady," Sam said with a nod. "It's been a while." Thomas remained quiet, sitting down and placing his bag by his feet. Martha spoke first. "We found suspicious activity at the abandoned warehouse north side. Dog tracks, chains, old bloodstains, and a puppy, clearly held captive there." Sam didn't respond immediately. He leaned forward, set down his cup, removed his glasses, and rested his hands on the table. "Martha Quinn runs Pet Haven," he said slowly. "And you?" His gaze flicked to Thomas. The man who sat alone by the lake for months, not uttering a word. Martha frowned slightly. This has nothing to do with Thomas's past. Maybe not, Sam interrupted evenly. But when you tell me there's an organized dog-snatching operation here, I need more than some paw prints in the snow and a stray puppy. Thomas stayed silent. He pulled from his jacket pocket the old collar, the faded silver tag now wrapped carefully in paper, and set it on the table, pushing it toward Sam. The number's faded. I've called. No answer. But collars like this match the recent missing dog cases Martha's been tracking. Sam picked up the tag, turned it slowly in his hand, his face unreadable, the silence stretching between them like a thread pulled taut. Then he set it down carefully on the table, folding his arms across his chest, his voice even, but carrying the weight of things unspoken. I'm not saying the two of you are lying, he said, leaning back into the creaking old chair. But you understand, don't you, Thomas? You're no longer the man this town trusts the way it used to. After the accident, after your daughter, you shut everyone out. You refused help. You disappeared into that cabin and let the world fall away. And people remember that. Thomas didn't flinch, didn't look away. His gaze, weathered and steady, met Sam's with a quiet calm, not the defensiveness of someone desperate to be believed, but the quiet gravity of a man who no longer felt the need to defend what simply was. A man who had found a strange kind of peace in truth, even if no one else shared it. I didn't come back to be believed, he said softly. I came back because that dog didn't find its way to the middle of the lake on its own. Someone put it there. Someone left it to die. And if no one else is going to do something about it, then I will. For a moment, the room was completely still, the kind of silence that seems to press against the walls and stretch time, until even breath feels loud. Martha reached over, resting her hand gently on Thomas's shoulder, a small gesture, but enough to shift the air, to temper the tension like a match gently extinguished before the flame could rise. Scout pressed closer to her side, ears perked, nose twitching without pause, as though the dog too could sense the fragile wire strung tight between the three of them. Sam exhaled, slow and audible, his expression softening just slightly. Not entirely convinced, but no longer closed. All right, he said after a pause. I'll send someone to check the warehouse district. But if there's nothing concrete, we can't launch a full investigation. Thomas nodded. We don't need special treatment, he replied. We just need to know you won't look the other way. Sam rose slowly, the weight of years evident in every motion, and crossed to the window, his gaze drifting beyond the glass, out toward the snowfall settling quietly on the rooftops of the little wooden houses, where the town, swaddled in a deceptive peace, seemed to sleep without a care, unaware of what moved in the margins of its silence. I used to be your friend, Thomas, he said, his voice quiet, reflective. And I used to believe that people could get through anything, any pain, any loss, but no one can do that if they spend their whole life running from it. Thomas didn't respond, didn't even look back. He stood, gently gathering Scout into his arms, the little dog still and silent, but carrying within him a fragment of a story no one had yet been willing to hear. That afternoon, as snow began once more to thicken its fall across the town, Thomas drove through the pine-lined road, returning with Scout to the cabin that sat like a lone memory at the edge of the forest. Darkness fell faster than usual, the sky smothered by leaden clouds, the wind howling through the mountain pass, flinging waves of snow against the fogged windows. Inside the truck, Scout lay curled in the folds of a thick blanket, his head resting gently on Thomas's thigh, his eyes half-lidded, floating somewhere between sleep and watchfulness. When they arrived, Thomas parked close to the porch, stepping out cautiously to inspect the surroundings before unlocking the door. Everything appeared untouched, the latch still secure, No unfamiliar prints in the snow, only the pristine stillness of fresh snowfall undisturbed. He stepped inside, lit the fire, and laid Scout gently onto the familiar cushion near the wood stove. The scent of burning pine and the soft crackle of flame soon filled the air, casting a fragile calm that hovered like frost on glass, delicate, momentary, and easily broken. Scout seemed exhausted. He nestled deep into the blanket, his head sinking into the folds, ears twitching faintly, not fully asleep, not quite alert, but held in a space of temporary safety. Thomas settled into the armchair by the fire, wrapping his hands around a cup of hot tea, eyes lost in the dance of flame. But his thoughts were not memories. They were a feeling, as certain as breath. Something was drawing near. Nightfall came fully at 8, bringing with it a wind that lashed against the cabin, sending bursts of snow thudding onto the tin roof like slow, deliberate knocks. Thomas drew the curtains, locked the doors, and placed a thick wooden staff by the fire, a habit formed over many solitary winters. Not out of fear, but the quiet understanding that caution was a kind of respect for the unknown. Around 9, Scout suddenly rose, not with a bark nor a whimper, but in complete silence, springing from his cushion like a wire pulled taut. His body froze mid-motion, ears upright, eyes wide, nose twitching in rapid bursts as he turned sharply towards the window. There was no hesitation, no puppy's startle. It was a warning. Thomas stood at once. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. Years spent in the wild, and longer still in solitude, had taught him that when an animal listens to something you can't hear, the worst thing you can do is ignore it. He extinguished the lights. The cabin fell into darkness, save for the flickering fire. Scout crept beneath the table by the window, body low, quivering not from cold, but from something deeper. A memory reawakened by scent, by sound, by something moving just outside, carrying with it the shape of a past that hadn't yet let go. And then, a sound. A single, soft click from the back door. Not loud, not urgent, but sharp enough to freeze the air in the room. Thomas didn't hesitate. He gripped the wooden staff with one hand, the small flashlight with the other, and stepped soundlessly toward the kitchen, toward the rear door that opened to the woods. Every footfall was measured, every breath held steady. His heart beat not with panic, but with the focused rhythm of a man who had survived too many nights with no one to call out to. His fingers reached the doorknob, metal cold as bone. He lowered his eyes, slowly, carefully, and saw what he already suspected. The lock had been tampered with. A long scratch marked the metal, and below, the snow on the threshold had been broken. Fresh prints, unmistakably human. Someone had entered the perimeter. Thomas stepped back, silent, returning to the main room, his eyes flicking to Scout. The dog still pressed to the floor, head lifted, eyes burning with awareness, tracking his every move. Another sound, this time from the front porch. Soft, too soft to be coincidence. A single footstep, slow and deliberate, upon the old wooden stairs. There was no knock, no voice calling out, only the presence, encroaching, silent, of something cold pressing close against the nape of the neck. Thomas crouched low, moved behind the table, reached under and gathered Scout into his arms. The dog did not resist. It pressed itself against him, small body warm and taut, but its eyes never strayed from the door, as if it knew exactly who, or what, waited on the other side. And then a shadow, vague, human-shaped, moved across the thin curtain, slow and purposeful. Thomas gripped the staff tighter. He didn't speak. He didn't ask, "Who's there?" Because something in him, something ancient and instinctual, already knew. Whoever came in the night wasn't looking for answers. And then, without warning, the front door shuddered. Just once. No breaking in, no stomping. Only a test. Thomas stood still. Scout emitted a low growl, not a bark, just a deep, quiet rumble from the depths of his throat, a warning barely spoken. And then, silence. The shadow retreated as quietly as it had come. No footsteps, no shifting wind, only the steady, soft patter of snow falling on the cabin roof. But neither Thomas nor Scout relaxed, not until they were certain the presence had passed beyond reach. More than half an hour later, when Thomas flicked the lights back on and searched the cabin once again, no new signs remained. Yet the broken lock was real, and Scout's gaze, clearer now than ever, was real too. Someone had come. Thomas secured every door, reinforcing them with wooden planks, drawing curtains tight, and plunging the cabin into darkness. It was no longer just a shelter, but a small fortress nestled deep in the woods. But inside Thomas, fear had morphed into something sharper, something primal, awakened, vigilance, reflex, readiness. And amid that tense stillness, a sound broke through, a low, steady noise that made Thomas freeze. Scout? A deep growl from the dog's throat, the first since Thomas had rescued him from the frozen lake. It was neither loud nor fierce, but it carried one undeniable truth. Fear had given way to instinct. Protection. Thomas knelt beside Scout, who lay beneath the table, no longer trembling. His eyes were wide, fixed on the porch door, as if he still saw what human eyes could not. His mouth parted slightly, lips pulled back to reveal a small row of sharp teeth. Not a threat, but a readiness. Thomas's hand rested on Scout's back. The fur bristled beneath his palm, his body tensed, stretched tight like a steel wire pulled to its limit. And in that moment, Thomas realized something he'd never imagined. Scout was no longer the fragile creature in need of shelter. Something inside him had shifted, and that change had come tonight. Near midnight, Thomas donned his coat and stepped outside. He needed to inspect the cabin's surroundings, at least to know from which direction the stranger had come and where they might return. Scout followed without being called. With every step Thomas took across the snow, Scout stayed close, ears pricked, head low, nose tracing the thin layers of snow as if scenting the lingering memories hidden beneath. The beam of Thomas's flashlight swept across bare bushes, over small indentations in the snow, nothing obvious, until it settled on the cabin's back door, the one broken by the intruder. There, a footprint was pressed deeply and clearly into the snow. A large boot, its edge sharp and defined. Not an ordinary hiking shoe, but a work boot, the kind seen on construction sites or warehouses. Thomas crouched to examine it closely. Scout moved in, sniffing at the snow near the print, then abruptly stopped. Another growl escaped, longer and clearer this time. Thomas couldn't smell it, but Scout knew. All too well. The dog shrank back, then turned his head to look up at Thomas as if to say, "That's him." Thomas memorized the shape of the boot print, and then carefully covered it with a small plank to protect it from the falling snow. He and Scout returned to the cabin, securing every lock with care, treating the house not just as a refuge, but as a front-line defense. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered weakly through thick clouds, shining through every crack in the wooden walls. Scout had managed a bit of rest, not deep, but peaceful. Thomas, however, had almost no sleep. He had spent the night beside the cold fireplace, eyes fixed on the old wooden walls, ears straining for the slightest sound. But instead of anxiety, something else had risen within him. Fire. A small flame, but enough to warm the place where before only ashes of memory had remained. He opened his notebook, sketching the boot print's shape with detailed notes, length, width, depth, planning to take it to Sam, even knowing the chief's skepticism. Yet, after last night, Thomas could no longer wait passively. Scout stirred quietly beside him, resting his head gently on Thomas's lap. Thomas stroked the dog's back, feeling each steady, warm breath beneath his palm. "You've remembered something, haven't you?" he whispered. Scout didn't answer, but those eyes, the unwavering focus on every movement around the cabin, spoke volumes. Thomas felt it clearly. This dog was no accident, no stray left behind. He had seen something, survived something, and last night that something had come back for him. That afternoon, Thomas took Scout for a slow walk through the forest behind the cabin. He avoided their usual path, choosing a wider, more open route. He wanted Scout to feel safe, and he wanted to watch the dog's reactions. At every turn, near every low bush, Scout glanced back, as if instinct had carved deep memories of a silence that would never last. Returning to the cabin, Thomas froze at the threshold. The leather glove he had left on the table was gone. The table untouched, the doors locked tight. But the glove? Missing. He stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning every detail. Then, near the window, on the narrow wooden sill, lay something new. A rusted coin, face up, untouched by snow or dust, as if just placed there moments ago. Thomas picked it up, cold to the touch, devoid of scent, bearing no mark that linked it to anything he remembered leaving there himself. And yet, without needing to search for signs or question the details, he understood with a sharp, sinking clarity that it was not something that had always belonged. Scout came closer, sniffed the coin, then let out a sound so faint it almost disappeared. Not a growl, not a bark, but a short, sharp breath, as if it had briefly forgotten how to breathe. And then, without hesitation, the dog turned away, lay down, and pressed its head firmly against Thomas's back, unmoving. Thomas understood. It was not a threat written in words, not a message scrawled in menace, but it was a sign, quiet, precise, deliberate, a signal that they knew, that someone, somewhere, was watching, that he had stepped too far, too deep, into something meant to stay hidden. The afternoon passed without incident, but not without weight. The coin, tucked inside the pocket of his coat, remained like a splinter of memory under the skin, harmless to the eye, but sharp against the palm whenever his fingers tightened, like a fragment of ash still glowing beneath cold embers. It didn't hurt, but it wouldn't let him forget. Scout lay still by the door, head nestled between his front paws, eyes wide open and unflickering. Each time the wind howled harder or the snow struck the roof with sudden force, one ear would rise, not in fear, but in vigilance. This small creature, once trembling and broken, no longer flinched like a stray. There was something new in his eyes now. The instinct of a being that had crossed through darkness and come out the other side changed. And then, as the horizon behind the mountains turned the color of blood, a sound emerged through the hush of snow. Faint, deliberate, unmistakable. Tires cutting softly across snowpack, the muted hiss of rubber against ice. Slow, measured. Thomas stepped onto the porch. The air was so still it seemed to swallow breath itself. Down the narrow, winding road that led deep into the forest, a path so seldom used that few even remembered it existed in winter, sat a silver-gray sedan, parked just beyond the wooden gate to his cabin, perhaps 100 meters away. The headlights were off. The engine had gone silent. No door opened. No one stepped out. And yet the car remained, not idling, not threatening, simply there like a third eye, unblinking, cold. Thomas tightened his fists. He neither advanced nor retreated. He stood exactly where he was, eyes fixed, spine steady, and watched until the vehicle slowly reversed, turned back the way it came, and melted into the descending twilight like a shadow that had been granted just enough time to make its point. That evening, he called Martha. "It's not an accident," Thomas said, his voice low and certain. "They're watching. And this time, they want me to know it." Martha didn't sound surprised. "Clara just called me," she replied, and transferred the line. A woman's voice came through, trembling but resolute. "Around 5 this afternoon. I was clearing snow off the awning when I saw it. A gray sedan, no front plate. It was parked at the mouth of the alley near your place. There was a man inside, cap pulled low, black coat, eyes locked in your direction. I thought it was odd. I stepped closer. But the engine started up and he drove off." Thomas thanked her, then asked again for the details. When the call ended, he and Martha began piecing the fragments together. "I think I know who it is," Martha said, her hands moving quickly through a thin stack of folders from a rescue organization she'd been working with. "Darren Vicks. He was arrested once in Minnesota for illegal possession of exotic animals. But the case fell through. Not enough evidence. There were later reports that he was using the front of a rescue center to collect retired working dogs and sell them across the border. Certified ones. Trained, documented. The kind that go for 5-6 times the price." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He opened his notebook instead, turning to the page where he had sketched the boot prints. His build? Tall, thin, sloping shoulders, black hair to the collar, always wears Oak Trail anti-slip boots, the exact type you described at the scene the other day. He nodded, closed his eyes for just a second. Nearby, Scout lifted his head, as if he too had heard the name. Not as a word, but through the tension in their voices, the electricity in the air. "We need proof," Thomas said quietly. "Or at the very least, we need to make sure he knows we won't be frightened off." Martha pressed her lips together. "I've got a few people on the team who wouldn't mind shadowing him. But Thomas, this isn't just your fight anymore. If it really is Darren, then those missing dogs, they weren't just abandoned." The next 3 days passed under a veil of controlled calm. Thomas stayed within the woods, but didn't barricade himself inside the cabin. He built a small wooden enclosure near the porch, encouraging Scout to reacquaint himself with the scents and sounds of the forest in the early morning frost. The dog now moved with ease, the limp in his hind leg nearly gone. But what mattered more than healing was what had returned to his eyes. He no longer looked downward. He had begun to watch. Each time Thomas stepped outside to gather firewood, Scout followed close behind, never once straying more than a step. On one occasion, a strong wind cracked a heavy branch to the ground. Scout flinched but did not flee. Instead, he stood in front of Thomas, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Not loud, not frantic, just present. Just enough. A protector remembering his duty. And then, on the afternoon of the 4th day, a fax came through from Martha, sent from the old veterinary station in town. It included photographs of the suspicious vehicle, along with a series of security stills from a camera positioned at the edge of the old industrial zone. The car had passed through 3 times in the last 2 weeks. In the final photo, a crucial detail emerged. Darren Vicks, caught mid-motion, opening the car door and lifting something out. Small, wrapped in cloth. It was unclear what it was, but the angle of the jaw, the vacant, icy eyes, the slant of the shoulders. It was him. It was the man Clara had described. Thomas looked at Scout, then folded the page. "We're close," he murmured. "Are you ready?" Scout didn't answer, simply stepping closer to nudge his nose against Thomas's hand, a silent gesture of approval, needing no words. That night, with the cabin warm and the forest wind beginning its haunting howl again, Thomas sat before the dying fire, sifting through the papers once more. The coin remained tucked safely in his pocket. Scout's collar hung from a wooden peg, a quiet reminder. He placed his hand gently on Scout's back, the dog now peacefully asleep, breathing slow and steady, and whispered, "If anyone ever thought you were just a stray, they'll know now they were wrong." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside Thomas's heart, the cold could no longer extinguish that flame. Near midnight, the sky unleashed the fiercest blizzard of the season so far. The wind screamed through cracks in the cabin walls, lifting layers of dust from the aged wood. Trees bent and creaked, dry branches scraping against the eaves like desperate claws scratching at a door. Scout stirred early, silent, steady, standing close to Thomas with eyes fixed on the door, as if sensing what was coming. Thomas blew out the fire, turned off the lights, drew the curtains, leaving only the faint glow of a small oil lamp tucked behind the kitchen cabinet. The cabin sank into a warm, heavy silence. But inside, no one slept. At exactly 1:47 a.m., the sharp crash of breaking glass shattered the quiet from the back window, quick and sharp as a blade slicing through the night. Thomas didn't move. He gripped the heavy wooden club, a solid oak chunk always kept under the table, and motioned for Scout to crawl beneath the bed. The back door slammed open with a long creak, footsteps thudding on the snow outside. Two dark figures spilled inside. Thomas couldn't make out their faces, only their tall shapes and long coats dusted with snow. The first stepped boldly to the center of the room, fearless, with a long metal rod in hand. "Show yourself, old man," a low, hoarse voice growled. No introduction needed. Thomas knew exactly who it was. Darren Vicks. Holding his breath, Thomas pressed against the doorframe. When Darren stepped forward, his foot caught the small rug near the hearth, and immediately Thomas lunged, throwing his body into a powerful shove, swinging the club hard into the intruder's shoulder. Darren staggered, swayed backward. The second man shouted and charged. Thomas twisted, swung the club again, striking the arm wielding a knife. The metal clattered to the floor, sharp against the howling wind. A moment of chaos, then a deep growl, not human, cut through the air. Scout exploded from under the bed like lightning, baring gleaming white teeth in the dim light. Without hesitation or fear, the dog lunged at Darren, targeting the left leg. A scream of pain tore from the man's mouth. Darren dropped to one knee, trying to kick back, but Scout held fast, teeth sunk deep into the calf, his eyes no longer those of a fragile puppy but of a warrior, a trained canine, a memory awakened, instincts returning. Thomas charged, tackling the second attacker who lunged at Scout. They crashed to the floor, Thomas's hands gripping the stranger's collar tightly, his face close enough to taste the cheap tobacco and stale liquor on the breath that cursed fiercely. Outside, sirens wailed. Flashing red and blue lights pierced the snowy haze, red and blue blurring against the thick white frost. A shout, "Police! Drop your weapons!" Scout released Darren as the front door burst open. 4 officers in heavy gear, faces covered by scarves and dark glasses, poured in. In moments, the small cabin transformed into a crime scene raid. The second man was subdued. Darren tried to crawl away, but Scout growled low, standing firm at the door, unyielding. One officer helped Thomas to his feet, quickly checking his wounds. Thomas shook his head. "I'm fine. Scout, that dog's the reason we're alive." The officer knelt, stroking the dog's head. Still standing, chest rising and falling steadily, eyes alert. This dog, trained. Very good. Very professional. Martha entered behind the officers, snow clinging to her coat, cheeks flushed from the cold but eyes bright and fierce. She looked at Thomas, then Scout, who was slowly relaxing, and nodded. "The vehicle and Darren's location have been verified," she told the commanding officer. "I've sent reports from 3 rescue centers, enough links to the missing K9 cases over the past 2 years. Chief Sam arrived, too. He said nothing at first, just stepped inside, scanning the wrecked cabin, then exhaled softly. "Seems I should have listened sooner," Sam murmured. Thomas said nothing, only looked down at Scout, now curled at his feet like seeking shelter after the storm. His hand settled gently on the dog's head, warmth spreading through the room's tense breath. Outside, the storm raged on, snow blanketing the steps and footprints, but inside, the fire was rekindled. Scout lay nestled in Thomas's arms, ears twitching lightly in lingering vigilance, eyes slowly closing in peaceful surrender. Thomas gently stroked the dog's back, his gaze drifting to the window, where the pulsing light from the police cruiser still flickered faintly across the frost-laced pane. And in that moment, he knew. This battle was far from over, and indeed, as dawn crept in, threading its silver light through the thinning veil of post-storm mist, the officers departed the cabin to carry out the warrant at the old warehouse site, the place where every suspicion had first begun to take shape. Thomas hadn't planned on going, but then Scout stirred, rose, placed a paw on his knee, and met his eyes with a look so clear, so fierce, it said without a sound, "We've come this far. We finished this together." A nod was enough. Martha drove them to the edge of the zone, a desolate stretch at the far end of the abandoned industrial belt, where snow had settled so thick and deep that only the imprints of police tires marked the path through frozen mud. The skeletal frame of the warehouse loomed in the distance, rusted, crumpled, hollow like the carcass of some long-dead thing. But inside, where life had once been imprisoned, the truth waited to be seen. The officers broke the lock. The metal door screamed open, its rusted rails shrieking like something wounded after years of being forgotten. And as the beam of the first flashlight cut across the darkness within, the entire team stood frozen, breath halted for a few stunned seconds. There, on the frozen dirt floor, were cages. Not one. Dozens. Stacked in disarray, some still bearing the twisted remnants of chains, others holding cracked feeding bowls stained with dried blood. On the walls, claw marks, bite marks, long, erratic lines etched into brick and steel, sketching the shape of desperation. Thomas stood at the threshold, his fist tightening by his side. Scout let out a low growl, not from fear but something primal, a reaction born from memory. The smell, thick and unmistakable, of old blood, matted fur, damp time, and abandonment, caused the dog's whole body to stiffen like a wire drawn taut. A young officer called out, voice echoing, "Over here! Fresh tracks!" They followed the gouges along the floor to a staircase hidden behind a false partition. Beneath, in the basement, they found 3 larger cages, the kind meant to hold multiple dogs at once. And in the far corner, torn bags of kibble split open, their contents laced with pre-mixed sedatives. "No doubt about it now," the chief murmured. "This was a holding site." Scout barked, just once, as the final cage was opened. No one said a word, but every pair of eyes turned toward him, the small creature once abandoned in the center of a frozen lake, now standing as the one who had led them to where the others still waited to be seen. On the ride back, Thomas remained silent. A long gash still marked his temple, a reminder of the night's earlier violence, and his left shoulder throbbed with a deep bruise that ached each time the truck jostled. But he made no mention of pain. He simply sat, one hand resting lightly atop Scout's head, The dog now curled beneath the seat, no longer wearied, but calm and clear-eyed, like a soldier returning from a battle that had shaped him. "This little guy," one of the officers murmured, glancing back. "He's the real hero of today." Martha smiled, her eyes catching Thomas's in the rearview mirror, and in that reflection something passed between them, unspoken. "Not just today," she said softly. "He's the reason you're still here, isn't he?" Thomas didn't reply, but his eyes softened, deeper now, steadier, as if the answer had already taken root in the silence between words. By late afternoon, the snow had stopped entirely. The final light of winter's sun slipped through the cabin windows, melting patches of frost along the eaves. Inside, Scout lay stretched on the old blanket near the stove, his head resting on one of Thomas's worn books. The warmth from the fire drifted through the wooden planks like a heartbeat, quiet, even, and alive. Thomas stepped onto the porch. The snow beneath his boots had turned soft. The wind no longer howled but whispered gently through the trees beyond. He looked toward the mountains, where the sun now dipped behind the ridge, then turned back to the old collar hanging inside the doorway. The question that had haunted him for days, who left Scout, might never be fully answered. But one thing, at least, was now clear. He had not let history repeat itself. And then, the following morning, he woke earlier than usual, not roused by wind nor stirred by unease, but by something unfamiliar, a kind of peace found only in silence. The fire still glowed faintly in the stove. Morning light poured through the window, soft and pale, landing on the wooden floor where Scout now lay stretched out fully, legs extended, body loose, head tilted, lips parted in what could only be described as the beginning of a dream smile. It was a morning without cold. Scout had slept soundly. No more curling in tight defense, no more startled jolts in the night. And Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he too had slept deeply. No nightmares, no shadows, just the quiet rhythm of breath beside him, and the gentle warmth weaving through every seam of the cabin. He rose, slipped on his coat, poured a cup of tea. And when Scout approached, now walking with more confidence, tail flicking gently, eyes lit with that familiar spark of trust, Thomas didn't call, didn't gesture. He simply opened the door, and together, they stepped out. Sunlight passed through the thinning canopy, branches glistening with the last of the snow. Birds had begun to return, and on the roof, where the bent metal sheet had been warped by last season's storms, the sun caught threads of rust, casting a soft copper glow, like memories being slowly pieced back together. Thomas stood quietly for a moment, then returned inside, pulling out the old toolbox he hadn't touched in years. Rusted nails were replaced with new ones. He climbed onto the roof, not cautiously, not merely to repair, but to rebuild. Each strike of the hammer echoed like an answer to the rhythm in his chest. Below, Scout sat in the yard, watching him, and each time Thomas paused, the dog would let out a short bark, not loud, just enough, like encouragement. The northern window was next. He sealed the frame, replaced the broken pane with new glass, wiped away the long, faded grime. And when sunlight streamed in again, clean and unbroken, Scout stepped forward, lay down, and stretched his body into the warmth. He did not move, and neither did Thomas, because this, finally, was the beginning. No more cracks for the wind to sneak through, no more creaks in the dead of night to send chills racing down the spine. The cabin was no longer just warm. It was strong, solid, unyielding, and Thomas realized, after all these years, he had been living somewhere that could never truly be called home, because his heart had never allowed itself to mend that broken place until today. That afternoon, Martha arrived with fresh baked bread, pausing on the porch to watch Thomas sweep snow from the newly repaired steps. She said nothing, only glanced down at Scout, now lying peacefully by the doorstep like a sentinel whose duty had been fulfilled, and smiled. "You fixed the window too?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, setting down the broom. "And the roof. Spring is coming soon." They sat together on the steps, steaming cups of tea warming their hands. Scout rolled in the snow before curling up in Thomas's lap, resting his head on his leg as if to erase every distance the years had carved between them. "He's really strong now," Martha said, stroking the dog's fur gently. "And you?" Thomas fell silent, eyes fixed on the distant forest where his shadows once dwelled, then quietly replied, "I'm learning to be strong again, too." The afternoon stretched slowly, snow melting to reveal damp earth beneath the wooden porch. Scout nosed into a patch of grass, pulling out an old leather glove. Thomas's glove, dirt-stained but intact. The pup carried it inside and placed it carefully before the hearth, as if offering a gift. Thomas laughed, a rare, clear sound that echoed warmly through the cabin. "Thank you, my friend." Scout barked softly, as if understanding every word. As night fell, Thomas lit the oil lamp. No longer did darkness weigh heavily in every corner. Everything, the light, the steady breathing of the dog resting his head on Thomas's foot, carried the unmistakable sign of life. The fire crackled gently in the stove. On the small table near the window, a neat wooden box sat closed, topped with a rolled wool cloth, guarding the secret inside. Thomas did not open it right away. He simply sat, eyes watching Scout's half-closed lids, the slight parting of his lips as if dreaming of some distant forest, a faraway snowy field, or simply the touch of a hand, gentle and steady, just as now. The next morning the sky was clear and bright, an uncommon gift after days of heavy snow. Thin wisps of clouds drifted silently across pale blue, and the sun sparkled as if freshly washed. Thomas brewed tea, wrapped a few slices of dry cake in a cloth bag, and softly called, "Scout." Scout sprang up at once, no questions asked, tail wagging lazily, his small footsteps leaving neat prints on the thawing snow. Thomas carried the wooden box, and together they left the cabin, following the trail that led toward Black Ridge Lake. The path to the lake was no longer slick and treacherous as those early days when Thomas first stepped onto the ice. The lake itself was thawing, dark edges of water creeping along the shore like a slowly closing wound from winter's grip. But here, the place where Scout had fallen, where Thomas had crawled across the biting ice, today greeted two figures returning with a changed air. Thomas settled onto the old wooden bench by the water, the very spot where he had once fished with his daughter. Scout circled once, sniffed the air, then curled close by Thomas's feet. Thomas rested the box on his knee and opened the lid. Inside lay a new collar, deep green with soft brown leather trim, simple yet sturdy. The silver ring in the center gleamed brightly, polished by Thomas's careful hands late into the previous night. Etched in confident, clear handwriting, deep enough to stand out against the metal, was the inscription, "Scout, if lost, please call Thomas Grady." Thomas held the collar, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of every letter, every character. This was more than a name. It was an acknowledgement that this being was no longer a stranger, no longer a pause in his life. Scout was a part, had become a part, and would remain a part of this home. He bent down. "Come here, boy." Scout lifted his head and stepped forward, allowing Thomas to remove the old collar. Worn and frayed, the scratched clasp, the tiny cracks on the faded metal tag, all marks of a hard-fought journey. Thomas took it one last time, then tucked it safely into his inner pocket. The new collar slipped smoothly over Scout's neck. Perfect fit, soft and gentle, and as Thomas fastened the clasp, Scout stretched his neck forward and gave a soft, quiet bark. By the lake, morning light shimmered on ripples lapping softly against rocky shores. The wind was calm, brushing through bare branches, carrying faint hints of pine mingled with the scent of melting snow. In that stillness, Thomas said nothing more. He simply sat quietly, hand stroking Scout's head, the dog who had become his greatest treasure, not a replacement for any loss, but a living reminder that love could still bloom. A shaft of sunlight fell slantwise across Thomas's shoulder, catching the sparkle of the new collar. Scout stretched, turned his head to look up at his master, eyes shining bright and clear like a child, hearing their name for the very first time. Thomas met that gaze and smiled. Not forced, not hidden, not bitter, but a real smile. For the first time, after all these years, a year had passed, since the night of the snowstorm, since the new collar was fastened with quiet care, and since those first hesitant steps brought the two of them back to the edge of Black Ridge Lake. Everything had changed. The cabin now stood beneath a new roof, each plank of wood placed by Thomas's own hands, guided at times by the help of Martha and Clara. The village gatekeeper, who once knew him only as the man in the woods, but now arrived most weekends bearing warm apple pie and a softer tone in her voice. The old window panes had been replaced with clean, clear glass, and the nail that once held Scout's first collar now gave way to a photograph. Thomas, Scout, and the two women, standing beneath the golden foliage of late autumn maples, their silhouettes edged by the sun, and the warmth of that moment captured in the folds of their coats, the creases of their smiles. And Scout, the small, trembling pup once found curled upon a frozen lake, was no longer a shadow of fragility, but strong, upright, his fur sleek and full, his gait steady and free, walking not with caution, but with the confident rhythm of something reborn, something that no longer needed to ask permission to exist. Yet in his eyes, those clear, deep eyes, there remained something unchanging. A glance always cast just slightly back, a brief flicker, as if to make sure the ones he loved were still following, still near enough to catch up to the path he now led. That morning, a soft breeze drifted through the lakeside woods. The ice had long melted, and in its place, the dark water shimmered beneath the clear March sky, reflecting light in ripples that bent and danced like memories reawakened. The three of them, Thomas, Martha, and Clara, walked slowly along the shoreline, their steps unhurried, their words few. Scout bounded ahead, never straying far, always pausing every few strides to glance back, tail wagging lightly, ears pricked to the symphony of a world shifting seasons. Martha chuckled, gently adjusting Clara's scarf with the kind of affection born from shared years and unspoken understanding. "I never thought I'd be waking up early to walk around the lake with a man like Thomas Grady," she said, her eyes still following Scout. Clara answered with the softness of wind brushing through pine. "I knew from the moment he carried that dog back. A man who risks his life for something trembling and broken in the ice is never someone who's truly given up." Thomas said nothing. He walked a few paces behind, hands tucked in his coat pockets, eyes drawn forward to where Scout chased a butterfly that hovered near the grass, leaping with such joy it seemed as though the sky belonged only to him. And every time he turned to look back, the dog paused, waited a moment, just long enough for Thomas to catch up, then continued forward. "He's like a guide," Martha observed. "Not guiding," Thomas replied quietly. just making sure I haven't lost my way." They stopped at the lake's edge, the same place as before, though the old wooden bench had been replaced by a stone one, smoother, sturdier, bearing an inscription carved not long ago, still clean and sharp. "For those who were once left behind and chose to return." Thomas sat. Scout padded close, rested his head gently against Thomas's knee, then curled up at his feet. His breath was steady, his eyes half closed, not from fatigue, but from peace. "I never thought I could come back here without hurting," Thomas said, voice calm, not breaking. "But now, it feels like something that's been made whole, not perfect, but enough to move forward." Clara nodded. Her gaze lingered on the lake, now flat, unbroken, no longer etched with cracks or laced with the threat of frozen death. Only the reflection of 3 figures and a dog beneath a sky that had finally forgotten how to weep. Scout lifted his head, gave a single quiet bark, as if he'd caught something in the breeze. Not danger, just a signal, a confirmation that winter had truly passed, that from the place once frozen over, once soaked in sorrow, something entirely new had begun to grow. Thomas stood. "Come on, Scout." The dog turned, ears perked, then trotted ahead, not fast, just enough for the 3 behind to keep in step. And as Thomas walked forward, he smiled. Not for the first time, but with the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has learned how to carry light without letting it flicker. Because beneath the ice, it turns out, spring had always been waiting.